You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events in America as well as around the globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the news this morning, first up, after the final states were called on Friday, with Georgia going to Biden and North Carolina going to Trump, Trump tweeted early Sunday that he, quote, concedes nothing, end quote. He's talking about the election, of course, the presidency, before tweeting late Sunday night that the Constitution had been, quote, shattered and violated, end quote, by the election, and that he had, quote, won the election, end quote. So, Jamarl, what you were talking about with the problematic trend we're seeing in American elections as the legitimacy of the presidency seems to be worn away, to be beaten back, basically, to be bitten away by each incoming president. We're seeing that again in this election pretty damn sharply, as neither side appears to be conceding to the other, of course, a follow-up to 2016. Jamarl, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't find this to be a positive. I mean, to be fair, Donald Trump said he was going to do it in the first place. And whether Democrats realize it or not, part of the reason that you take policy that is in the interest of the public, that gets the mass support, that you aren't running with this race to the bottom, but you're doing so in an affirmative campaign, is to prevent people like Trump from getting in office. Because now he doesn't have to concede. And all of the issues associated with this notion of who's sovereign come to the forefront. And so, that's what I think about it. I think you don't let people like Trump win in the first place. And you do that by attending to the public. They didn't do that. Trump gets in office, and now you have a secondary problem of the guy not wanting to leave office. That's not good. I mean, it looks like he's lost this race. So him tweeting his way to a coup doesn't seem like it's going to work. But hey, let him get his lawsuits. Let him get his court cases. Let him get his recounts. It's his right.
It's interesting. That's an interesting take, Jamarl. We're going to come back to that during the show, of course. In D.C. on Saturday, the pro-Trump Million MAGA march was predictably marred by violence as the Proud Boys and Antifa continued to fight as the day wore on during the event. This was followed by Trump calling Antifa, quote, Antifa scum, end quote, repeatedly on Twitter. No way to unify a nation like that. Biden's incoming chief of staff, Ron Klain, has called for an immediate transition, asking the Trump administration Sunday to reverse course and begin working on a presidential transition this week. The federal government has not yet gotten a key determination from the General Services Administration that would allow agencies to begin to cooperate with the transition, which Klain said on NBC News, Meet the Press, has left the Biden team unable to speak to current administration officials or begin planning for how to take over during a crisis that has killed more than 240,000 people in America alone. And Jamarl, I would just say this is another extension of the exact same problem we were just talking about. It's not just the president. It's not just the office of the president. It's not just that office being sort of tarred and feathered consequently by each election problem. It's that the actual transition in terms of the bureaucracy is reestablishing itself every 4 to 8 years. If that gets slowed down, then when the administration comes in, it's like you don't have the time to prepare. It's as if you're going into the test without having studied for it, and you're sort of having to wing it as you go in some sense. If you can't bring your people in, if you can't set them up, if you don't have the administration, your administration set up, then that definitely slows you down. On the other hand, I do just want to briefly give credits to the idea that there is a possibility. We've had guests on, we'll get guests on in the future, I'm sure, who are going to say and who have said that, that there's a good case to be made here, that there was enough, not just voter fraud here, but enough voter fraud to have swung the election for Biden. As of yet, though, that's unproved, just to be clear. But again, Jamarl, the administration, this is also something, by the way, just to briefly comment, also something I heard about back in 2016, where Obama made it a bit difficult for Trump to bring his people in. And then when Trump did come in, he was doing it as such a dissident that he practically threw everybody vital out and had to replace them, largely from people who are unqualified to do their jobs. Anyway, what's your take on this?
When Trump got in office, Obama sat with him, shook his hand. Obama seemed over the top to welcome Trump into office. And if I'm not mistaken, Obama was trying to kind of give Trump, I don't know, a pep talk, or trying to, I guess, push him in a certain direction on certain things that need to take place and reasons that they need to take place. I mean, kind of the same talk that Bush gave to Obama. And Obama being the ultimate person of conciliatory, trying to bring sides together, I don't see what they were talking about with this notion that Obama didn't necessarily help Trump's transition team. In fact, it was the opposite of that. I don't agree with that. I think that's bull.
I think he kept up appearances. I think he did the meeting, but his administration was filled with people who, as you have seen over the last 4 years, hated Trump hated what he represented. And it's if you're going to blame Trump for his COVID response, despite most of it, at least a large portion, probably most of it being what his administration did, it's the same thing with Obama and the transition. I don't really care to disambiguate too much between the two because they're the head of state. That is their job.
What are you talking about?
To be the head
I
of
have no idea what you're talking about. The Obama transition team and the Trump transition team are the same. What are you talking about? That makes no sense. When Obama came in, his highest priority was making everybody think that he was the Obama that was going to bring sides together. When Trump got in office, he did the exact same thing with the thought of bringing down the hysteria in the country. Go back to 2016. What were people thinking, especially Democrats? They were freaking out. You had people losing their minds when Trump was elected. Obama's goal wasn't to make that worse. That wasn't his goal. That wasn't his objective. This is no drama Obama we're talking about. I'm saying this as somebody who doesn't even like Obama.
Didn't he preside over the wiretapping stuff? But didn't he preside over, like, in his latter days, the wiretapping? Again, you can say that he's a conciliatory figure as a statesman, but that doesn't mean that as a head of state, he didn't preside over an administration that made it very difficult for the Trump team to come in the same way, possibly to a lesser degree, than Trump is making it very difficult for the Biden team to come in. I'm just saying they're of an ilk. Whatever their appearances may be, and whatever his superficial, whatever the vagaries may be in terms of his superficies as a statesman, his administration bungled it in the same way that Trump appears to be bungling this one. That's my point.
I mean, what are we talking about? He bungled the transition?
Yes.
What do you have to show for that? The comments of a liar?
You can see it. Which liar, Trump?
Yes. Donald Trump lies as easily as breathing. I don't take anything that Trump says is serious, if I'm being honest. Okay. So what are you using to say that the Trump transition was similar or identical to the Obama transition?
The other people within his administration. If you're not going to listen to either Trump or the people within his administration, then it's unfalsifiable.
No. Don't misunderstand me.
There's no way of knowing.
There are people in Trump's administration I would listen to, so don't misunderstand me. And if Trump says something and there's something to back it up, then fair enough. But Trump's administration just saying, oh yeah, Obama didn't help us either, it's not enough. I mean, come on. Okay, we disagree on that. We just disagree. I don't see anything that kind of makes sense.
It's also not just him. No, but we do disagree, but we can come back to it. And I'm sure, this is the thing. Once you establish a fault line, you kind of rally your troops along it. In the same sense, we're going to look for evidence to back up our positions. And then ultimately, ideally, we come to some sort of a compromise or some sort of an agreement on the other side of the facts as we come back to it. In any event, we've got other news to get to. The Gray Zone last week reported on Biden's appointee as the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Richard Stengel, highlighting his support of the use of propaganda against American citizens. Rick Stengel was the longest-serving Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in U.S. history. And I'm just going to quote here. This is stuff that Stengel said in 2018. Quote, my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist. I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population, and I don't necessarily think it's that awful, end quote. Again, this is Rick Stengel, Biden's appointee as the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. That's effectively responsible for managing like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and these other sort of international platforms, but also platforms pointed at home. In a COVID update, officials in the United States have reached more than 11 million total cases of coronavirus as of Sunday, as cases passed 10 million just a week ago, and more than 1 in 400 Americans have tested positive since. At least 623 new coronavirus deaths and 135,187 cases were reported in the United States on November 15th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 150,265 new cases per day. That's an increase of 81% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of Monday morning, more than 11,112,800 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 246,000 have died. Again, the death numbers are still lagging behind the new infections. But Jamarl, I think you were shocked. You were highlighting this a couple of times. I believe it was last week that the new cases had risen by like 1 million in 10 days. Now it's down to less than a week. Past 10 million. As cases passed 10 million just a week ago, more than 1 million cases in the last week. Kind of crazy, right?
That's insane. I mean, like, and it's obviously getting worse. Like, it's not like, oh, I feel this is getting worse. No, it was, in 14 days, it was 1 million cases. In 10 days, there was 1 million cases. Now, what, 7? Yeah. That's, I mean, like, and what's wild about this is that the president of the United States is tweeting his way to trying to stay in office and paying no attention to this at all. Like, this doesn't even matter anymore. This is not even in his purview. Like, apparently Trump hasn't even been going to the COVID meetings. And, you know, honestly, that may even be better for the COVID meetings. But if nothing else, there is no head, there's no anything paying attention to this. It's just kind of uncontrolled. It's amazing.
He's fighting sort of existentially for re-election, yes. Which again, I don't think that's the way to handle this.
Which makes this matter less, right? He's like, I'm just trying to stay in office, man. This other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of shows the man behind the curtain. In any event, on Sunday, Peru's interim president Manuel Moreno stepped down only 5 days after he assumed the post, again, as interim president. Moreno was the president of Congress until being appointed interim president after Congress impeached former President Martin Vizcarra over corruption allegations. That was a week ago on Monday. Vizcarra has denied those allegations. Vizcarra's impeachment sparked protests across the country starting Monday, and those continued for 6 nights in a row, leaving at least 2 people dead and 94 injured on Saturday night. The RCEP, we were talking about this, I believe it was last Thursday with Bradley Blankenship. It was definitely late last week. We were talking about this with him. 15 nations have signed on to it as of yesterday morning. It's the largest trade deal in the world. A big coup for China, a big diplomatic success, and an economic success, of course, too, for China. The signatories include 30% of the world's population and GDP, and they will reach 2.2 billion consumers approximately. To be clear, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that's what we're talking about, is made up of 10 Southeast Asian countries, as well as South Korea, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The deal excludes the U.S., which withdrew from a rival Asia-Pacific trade pact in 2017 under Trump. Several rockets have hit near the airport in Eritrea's capital, Sia of Asmara. The rockets were fired from Ethiopia's Tigray region, 5 diplomats have said, as the conflict between government forces and a separatist group spilled beyond Ethiopia's borders. At least 2 of the rockets hit the Asmara airport on Saturday evening, 3 of the diplomats said. However, the United States Embassy contradicted those reports, saying there were, quote, no indications the airport was struck, end quote. Nevertheless, it did confirm reports of, quote, a series of loud noises, end quote, in the vicinity, and told U.S. citizens in Eritrea to remain in their homes on Sunday. This move threatens to precipitate a wider conflict in the Horn of Africa in what has hitherto been a conflict restricted to Ethiopia's borders, as President Abiy Ahmed contests for political control with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And last headline here, SpaceX launched 4 astronauts to the International Space Station on Sunday on the first full-fledged taxi flight for NASA by a private company. The Dragon capsule on top, named Resilience by its crew in light of this year's many challenges, most notably COVID-19, reached orbit 9 minutes later. It is due to reach the space station late Monday and remain there until spring. A quote here from the commander, Mike Hopkins: by working together through these difficult times, you've inspired the nation, the world, and in no small part the name of this incredible vehicle, Resilience, end quote. Once reaching orbit, he radioed, quote, that was one heck of a ride, end quote. Sidelined by the coronavirus himself, SpaceX founder and chief executive Elon Musk was forced to monitor the action from afar. He tweeted that he, quote, most likely, end quote, had a moderate case of COVID-19, and of course they required the quarantine due to that. With that, those are our headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are going into a break. And on the other side of this break, we will be back with Jamarl's monologue. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. See you on the other side of this break.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane.
Hello.
Welcome on Radio Fault Lines.
Guys.
If you guys are... Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. I apologize. My other mic was on. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share this video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. You know, it's funny. I started the show thinking I was going to do Chuck Schumer's interview. Now, this interview took place on November 3rd, and it's before the election, and it's a great point where the Democratic Party is trying to put out all stops in regards to this is what we represent and this is what Joe Biden is going to do. November 3rd. Now, the beauty of this is it gives a good contrast to the next year at, 2024, or for that matter, within 100 days, because supposedly this is potentially Biden's program. But again, this is Schumer before the election. And this is Schumer pulling out all the stops to try to get as many people as possible to vote Biden in office and to vote him as leader of, Speaker of the House, leader of the Senate. Now, whether or not, this clearly didn't work. And maybe, I mean, if we're looking at Georgia and they get the two Democrats to win in Georgia, then Chuck Schumer will become head of the Senate. But it's Georgia. Republicans have always won those Georgia elections. By the same token, this year, a Democrat won that Georgia state. You never know. Still up for grabs. We have no idea who's going to be in charge of the Senate, even though it looks like the Republicans still are going to retain control. It was something Shane said, though, that I thought was really interesting. Before we go to it, just be aware. In this interview, no autopsy, no full recognition that the money in politics affects the behavior of the individual in those politics. And the only thing Schumer wants you to think of is, if we get in office, Joe Biden's first 100 days, $15 minimum wage, executive order to get rid of $50,000 of student debt, the Green New Deal or an environmental or climate program that takes in racial, economics, et cetera, all of these big ideas. He said it has to be like FDR, November 3rd. Now, the question becomes, when Joe Biden takes office, what are those first 100 days? And you can compare everything that happens to what Schumer is saying. And whether he has the Senate or whether McConnell has the Senate, the executive order to get rid of student debt is very specific. We'll see if Biden does it. At the end of the day, it's going to be the Schumer who said it, not Biden. And beyond that, it's going to be, Republicans were stopping me from doing this and that. It's going to be doing stuff, deals that McConnell wants, the cabinet members. The excuse is going to be the Republicans are making us do this. This is not what we wanted to do. Left to our own devices, we'll be doing something that would be in the best interest of America, but this is all we got. That's what you're going to see. It's going to be the Obama-esque thing where Joe Biden is basically leaning on Republicans so he can have an excuse to not do things that are in the best interests of the country. And to be honest, Biden needed elected, saying he was going to do anything that was good for the country. He just got elected saying, I'm going to be Joe Biden, whatever that meant. One interesting topic, though, that Shane brought up that caught my interest was this topic in question of propaganda. And the argument that basically every team does propaganda. Every country does propaganda. Even in the best of scenarios, your country still will be giving you propaganda. Now the question becomes, is it true? You can give somebody a point of view that you want them to have because you believe it's in the best interest of the country as a whole. You may even, from the standpoint of government, believe it is right. You may even be right that it's right. It's still propaganda, because it's still just the point of view. If you're ever looking at Discovery, Star Trek, I always trash Discovery. One of the interesting things, though, is when they're in a shadow universe and they're talking about the Federation. And usually on Star Trek, you get these people who are upstanding and they believe in freedom and justice and they believe in people having their free choice and everything else. They understand, however, that for a person to be free and for the person to even get to the point of being able to determine for themselves, you have to have an underpinning that allows you to get to that point of view. Meaning there is no situation where you as a baby sitting in a field is going to automatically become this amazing person. It takes a beginning. It takes indoctrination of some sort. It even takes you to be given a point of view. Whether that point of view grows, whether that point of view recedes, whether that point of view allows you to alter that point of view, whatever that is, your society, the underpinnings of it, is the thing that allows the people to be thrown into the world of sorts. And how they would do in that world is a large part in how their society was crafted. The organization, the logic of your society is going to control the parents, the upbringing of those parents, the way they raise that kid, whether or not there's healthcare, whether or not there's education, whether or not there's clean air, whether or not the streets are clean, whether or not somebody's going to hit them over the head when they're going to their car or pursue their affairs. All of those things are entirely determined by that particular society and how that society propagates itself. In some way, it's determined by the logic of that society, and that logic is enforced through propaganda. Why do you think that all countries, when they're talking about their origins, when they're talking about their upbringings, it's glorious? It's the great patriotic, or it's the founding of this country. It's, all of these myths, all of these ideas that go into this notion of making you feel proud of wherever you are, wherever that country is, even if that country is considered a pariah. You in that country feel patriotic about that country. Look, all the countries, to some degree, have it. And I know people are going to take shots at Biden's campaign chief for saying that, but what he's saying just so happens to be true. Just because it's propaganda doesn't necessarily mean it's a lie. And the fact of the matter is you're stuck in a world, in a society, in a reality that is washed in perspectives. And yes, some of those perspectives are going to align themselves with objective reality, but other perspectives are so subjective that they don't. An individual can say, as long as I'm doing okay, I don't care about anybody else. I can get my job, I can get my ends. I do not care if 50% of the population is in squire, is living, in trash and squalor. I don't care. As long as I am good, the world can burn. Those people are out there. Is it wrong for that person to say that? Depends on your point of view. He doesn't think he's wrong. I think it's monstrous. And the wild part about it is there are structures of society that are logically put together that cannot be disambiguated. Meaning, if you want to have this great life, having 50% of the world burn will never allow you to have that great life. Those people will come for you. That's the catch. You could have a world in a particular way. It doesn't even have to be a great world. You can have a world where you are great and everybody else is screwy. But there are certain realities that come along with that particular outcome. And there's certain realities that people need to realize that you cannot disambiguate. I understand this argument about propaganda. I don't for once believe that the propaganda that this guy on Joe Biden's campaign is talking about is positive, is good. If anything, is going to be purely in the best interest of the Democratic Party or Joe Biden, just like Russiagate was. Russiagate was propaganda. Russiagate was a psyop that was on the American public to attack one of the political campaigns, that campaign being Donald Trump. It is literally propaganda. What they are arguing that The Affordable Care Act is universal health care. That is literally propaganda, a pushback on what Republicans are saying, that basically it is government-run health care, or that these people are missing health care, meaning you have 20 million people that don't have health care. I mean, you can go across the board with this stuff. It is not just other countries that do it. We do it here also. When they're saying Syria, drop those chemical weapons. And then you have all of these holes in the story. And then you have people who are there coming out, whistleblowers, saying that didn't happen. That didn't happen. And you have the mainstream media that ignores it. When Tulsi Gabbard comes out and says, we were supporting terrorists, Jake, and Jake Tapper paddles away saying the government says it's not true. All of that is propaganda. The difference is there are things that are true. And we can make a distinction and say, okay, things that are true aren't propaganda. I don't think that's true. I think all of it is to some degree propaganda. But I'm making the very point that that is something that your government does. People are going to hit Joe Biden's guy for saying that. But what he's saying just so happens to be true. Your issue is, do you want to deal with the fact that these guys are basically feeding you a load of garbage in order for you to back a particular candidate, a particular party, a particular tribe, a particular idea, etc.? If your country was structured in a way that was rational, and you could allow people information that allowed them to come to a particular conclusion because it was in their best interest, then this notion of having lying propaganda matters less. But that's not where we are. We're in a world of crap. And in this very specific situation, you have parties that don't necessarily want to do the rational act and lead to the best outcome because those parties need massive amounts of cash. And in lieu of giving you the best outcome is always out of reach. In lieu of doing what is in the best interest of the public, what is clearly in the best interest from the standpoint of bringing people to the party and allowing people to win that vote. No, that's not what's done. Instead, Chuck Schumer guy, Rick Santelli, or Richard Stingel, his argument for the propaganda, even though it is true, is problematic. Because I, for once, don't believe that what Joe Biden is going to do in that office is going to be great. I don't believe for one moment that what Chuck Schumer is saying Joe Biden is going to focus on is going to be the focus. And what is going to take place in lieu of that is identity and a great heaping of propaganda. What do you think, Shane? Like I said, I think propaganda is something that all governments do. It's not that I think the guy's lying. It's just that I think in regards to what Joe Biden is going to do, the propaganda this guy's going to have to put out is not going to be all that truthful. What you got? What do you think?
I agree with that. And I mean, that's one reason to disagree with it. You can also disagree with it in the sense that, like Trump with the Syria oil fields comments, you get just a little bit too brazen, a little bit too on the nose with what the policy actually is. You know, maybe we should be criticizing this guy for sort of lifting the veil on what, frankly, not just the United States, but many world governments do. I mean, you could look at it from that perspective. You could also indict the idea, or at least the use of the word propaganda in general. What is propaganda? I mean, frankly, how can you disambiguate propaganda from any form of political media, from any form of media that's meant to persuade? This is a debate I remember having, a sort of sophomoric debate with my friend Chris years and years and years ago, when we were probably a little bit too young to be talking about this kind of stuff, probably didn't really understand it. And frankly, you could have a long conversation about that. I think it applies. It might bring you down to some of the philosophical roots. Another side of this, there are a couple of different ways in here. Another side of this is, okay, if you ask, if our world is increasingly propagandized, if we're living in a world, through the internet, through mass media, through practically every form of media that's mediating reality to us, that's trying to give us some set of narratives. If we're living in this world, if we're completely saturated by propaganda, what is real? Where can you find reality? Is it what you can touch and feel? Is it, what you can do with your own two hands? Is it the relationships you can have with the people you love? I don't know. All interesting conversations. Another wider lens or angle into this is, if there is no standard, if there is no objective truth, if there is no standard or there is no frame by which we can judge whether any individual thing is more or less true, then everything in some sense is just a perspective. Everything is propagandized to us, either by our own evolutionary needs or by the needs of some higher political entity. And therefore everything is fake, nothing is real, and we're just lost in this sea adrift. I don't know. I think ultimately that buck, that sort of epistemological buck, has got to stop somewhere. Where it stops is up to us to determine. Because I think if it doesn't stop, frankly, then it's not just that ethically we're left with no moorings. It's that our societies, as you're saying, lose that legitimacy. They lose that underpinning. And the societies that can maintain that underpinning tend to survive, while the ones that lose it tend to fail. And so I think existentially, we need to figure out how to find truth again. It's like a base existential need. And I think that's ultimately what this kind of conversation comes down to.
Yes.
But
perfect.
It's a little bit more time than we have for this segment. In any event, we've got to go into a break. That's my take, Jamarl. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we will be back in just a minute with Elijah Magnier, veteran war correspondent. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.7
No Elijah just yet.
in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Joining us in a few. Elijah will be here in a few. But Shane, I agree with you, man, on the last topic. Often you hear me say nothing is true. And I say it flippantly, kind of, but I say it for that very specific reason. It is very hard to put your hands on what's true. And you hear people, while we wait for the guests, over the last weekend, my wife has been greatly annoyed with me because I've been binge watching this thing called Vanderpumps. I've gone through 4 seasons this entire weekend. I am not ashamed of it. It is my guilty pleasure. Love that show. One of the fascinating aspects.
Wait, what is it?
It's called Vanderpumps. It's called Vanderpump Rules. It's this restaurant that's in California where it's like a reality show. I am enthralled by that show. It's the drama of it all, right? Because I don't act that way. And so when I see people, I'm fascinated by that. They're friends, but the conflict. Like for me, when I get pissed at somebody, it's the end of it. I can go about my life. I have no issue with it at all. To me, friends are only there when your life is in sync. If you fall out of sync, they're not there. Now, I don't fault them for that. I just consider them people in there having their life. But these guys are much closer than that, even though they fight constantly. And I keep thinking to myself, any of those fights would have been the end of that fight. And so I'm fascinated. I'm enthralled by the show. My wife hates it. But every so often, they would be like, this is the truth. And they would be like, the truth is this. And they would give you a perspective that is entirely wrong. And you're like, truth? Like it's like the way people throw this word around so casually, as if it's like, what I am saying here is the absolute, complete, flat, fact truth. The reality is, most of those things go from 0 to 1, and it's somewhere in between. And the idea that it could be flat, fact truth is not the easiest thing in the world. And I'm always suspicious when I hear that. Always.
Jamarl, what about the blind man and the elephant? What's your take on that? Right. As a view of the truth? You know the parable I'm talking about, right?
It's like each person fills a part, they fill the tail, and like, this is the truth of this particular situation. Somebody fills the snout, exactly. This is the truth. Yeah.
I mean, I guess here's where I'm going with that, is that I would see that as probably the most accurate version of the truth that you can find. And then what you're ideally going for is you talk to different people, you get their different takes, you try to think out in advance, you try to come up with either some laws or you try to anticipate some tests that you can do. Either way, you're coming up with these different sort of forays into the unknown. And then, ultimately over time, you come up with a truth in common that's resilient enough to withstand the scrutiny and skepticism of everybody who's witnessing and sort of testing your definition of the truth. And that is the truth. That is as close as you're going to get. It's an iterative process. It's almost like a scientific process of coming to the truth. That is a kind of truth. Another kind of truth. I mean, technically, and this is the Cartesian thing, in a sort of radical skepticism sense, you think, therefore you are. You know that you are experiencing these sensations. You don't even know that those sensations are true in any sense that they exist outside of you, but you know that they exist. You know that what you are experiencing exists. And therefore, something is true. Something exists. Something is there to be with, is there to stand against your sensations. It's there to be perceived, and it is in that sense true. I mean, there are different kinds of truth, I guess.
Yeah, but that one's problematic. Well, that one's a problem.
That one is definitely problematic.
Because that one
it
just
doesn't get you too
basically
far.
keeps you as the only thing that I know is true is me, and everything else is basically up for grabs. Now, you can live that way
It's
because you can make the assumption, and you can say, okay, I'm assuming that these other things out there, and at least for me, what I do is I just assume that there's other stuff out there. I don't know it. And whether I believe it or not, it can affect me. It can attack me. It can put, hooks in me. All those things could take place. So whether those things are real or not, clearly I'm enmeshed in something that has some kind of entanglements in some kind of way that I have to accept is true, whether I want to believe it or not. It's like it's the pain of it all that makes it real. Otherwise, you can ignore it. So I don't know. Whatever.
There's another. Yeah, well, it's just I hear what you're saying with that. I mean, and we could have an interesting conversation potentially at some point about Descartes, called the father of modern philosophy, the father of sort of Western philosophy in the sort of neo-Western sense, not in the classical Western sense, but the father of modern philosophy as such. And the idea that like he created through that sort of solipsistic radical skepticism, maybe the idea of the individual, the idea of the modern idea of the individual. And there are problems with that. Like you shouldn't assume maybe that people are fundamentally distinct and coherent and concrete at their base. And that if you assume that as your basic axiom in your philosophy and you build other things on top of that, then you're going to get a bunch of false beliefs built into your system, built into your way of looking at the world based on that. That's another conversation. One thing here, though, is, I mean, we go back and forth on the idea of truth as such. We've gone back and forth on that for months now. I just want to say, there's this quote. I'm constantly trying to find it. I can't remember who said it, but I like it. It's the idea that cynic is a sort of romantic in disguise. If you're cynical about the world, if you have a sort of morally skeptical view of the state of things as they are, if you're pessimistic on a deeper sense about something that seems important to other people, then what that means is at an earlier point in your life, you were a romantic about it. You really cared about it, and you're sort of covering over the lack of that thing by rejecting it and saying, oh, it doesn't exist anywhere, it can't exist. And therefore, you're sort of hiding yourself from the hurt. I feel like that, and I don't want to get too personal here, because I see some of this stuff in myself, too. I think we have this in common. I think that holds true with you and the truth. I think that fundamentally, you have a real strong desire to find what is the truth about this thing? What is real here? What if we get down to the bedrock, if we investigate further and further and further, what is the fundamental nub? What does this thing come from? What is it really? You see what I'm saying? And I think that a lot of people have that in common. I think that's a sort of unmet yearning that a lot of people in our society, in our world have at this point, as we're living in a world that seems to have rejected truth as such almost completely and is now propagandized from one end or the other by different visions of what the truth may be. Jamarl, what's your take?
That's true to some degree. I mean, when I was younger, I used to have this thought that all of these things mattered. Like, me being able to play chess this well matters. Getting master level matters. Being able to read all of these books, being able to do this well in school, being able to learn as much as you can learn about whatever. These things matter. The pursuit of information, the pursuit of knowledge makes one more apt, more adequate. And then somewhere along the way, I realized that why does it matter? And I couldn't really answer that. Basically, it mattered because it mattered to me. It's like if the guy was, could lift a huge amount of weights, or if the guy was extraordinarily beautiful, those things would matter to him. My looks, gets me this. My looks gets me that. These are the things that are important, etc. Meaning, the attributes that an individual will have can make that person more in mind to believe that those things are important, or those things are great, or those things are X or Y. And I think the problem that I kept having was, is it true? And there was no way to kind of make that thing of whether it was true or not. The answer was no, it's not true. It's not true or false. It's neither of those things. It's purely dependent upon the situation you're in. If you are in a society that needs to grow and develop, etc., then that society is going to prize the engineers of that world. That society is going to prize the people who can build it. The people who can't are going to matter less. But that's not an absolute. That's entirely dependent upon the society itself and the things that it needs. It's priority and environmental dependent. There is nothing above our point of view. And so that becomes a problem, right? Like if I'm as a human being thinking to myself, okay, what matters? Then I'm stuck with this notion that What the individual perceive matters. That's it. There is no higher point of view. And
well, even if society itself presents a higher point of view,
it doesn't matter.
I'm sorry for cutting you.
Yeah,
well,
it still doesn't matter. It's just society's point of view.
Here's where it might matter, but I don't know if this matters. So we're part of society. Society is a part of DNA or life, and life even is a part of the universe and the sort of physical laws of the universe. You have these nested layers of meaning here, where the individual, as far as we can tell, unless you want to go down to microbiology or how we're constructed, the individual is the sort of basic unit of familiar meaning, and then we can more or less understand different elements of how the society works, how sort of DNA as such, life, this biological entity that we're all, constituting in part, and how that fits into the universe, the physical laws of the universe, with which physics, astronomy, et cetera, more or less give us the tools to feel like we understand. Like there are these nested layers of meaning, and it seems like the hope is that as you sort of get up to those higher levels, you're going to get a deeper glimpse into the meaning that we're a part of. I think here's where the problem with that comes in. If you look at the history of civilization, if you look at the history of the societies that we've built, in large part, we have built those sort of against the enmity of those higher structures. Like we've had to deal with natural disasters. Nature as such is a pretty scary thing for us. We really try to keep nature at bay. If you look at our houses, we try to sanitize them pretty well and keep the quote unquote vermin out, pull up the weeds, et cetera. So there are these sort of, it's weird because you'd think on the one hand, okay, you're going to get more meaning or more truth as you go up the stack. On the other hand, it seems like we're a part of this civilization, a part of this society that is built on keeping the other levels of that stack at bay. Does that make any sense, Jamarl? Like this weird contradiction to it?
Kind of. I would just make the point that there is no such thing as meaning. Meaning is given entirely through intellect or through consciousness. Everything just is. Like, I know what you mean when you're trying to say, like, but the meaning is not inherent. It's, again, given entirely through thought. If there was no person here, everything would just be. It's the person that adds meaning to the entire situation. It's the intellect, whatever that is, be it from human beings or from something else. Otherwise, it just is. Like, I get it. This is a maddening perspective. And it's like, where do I put my hands down in regards to what's true? But the reality of it is, things just are. And, we become a factor of this. And a lot of other things started getting added, like a fish in water, that we just believe is there. That is not there. It's here. It's us. If that makes sense. It's like we are adding a huge amount of stuff to this that we are pretending just is. If we weren't here, none of that would be. That is important to understand. Like it's not inherent. Like the meaning that something is going to be given is entirely dependent upon the consciousness that's giving that meaning. I would agree with you that there's some things that are inherent. Like reality seems to prize love or cooperation. Like if you're looking at atoms, if you're looking at cells, tissues, those type of things, those things come together in order to make a larger being that becomes an emergent consciousness that can observe and understand its world. Emergent. Even human beings coming together, being able to push back against the elements of the planet, being able to build structures, being able to send stuff from our planet to somewhere else. Those things require a certain degree of cooperation that can never take place with individuals being single. So I do think love is kind of this inherent thing, or let's say relationships or working together or cooperation. But I don't know. I find that stuff to be difficult to put your arms around. And I guess that's where philosophy comes in, trying to grasp it and whatnot. But we're in a weird, fascinating reality that we take for granted because it happens constantly.
Well, then there's this idea that we're living here's another you're looking at love from a sort of physical perspective, and that's an old idea. I forget exactly where that comes from. I think it has a couple of different origins. But the idea that the universe is pulled together by love, that the organisms that we are pulled together by the sort of attraction of the basic physical constituents, that love is built into the universe on a deep level. And then what we get is fear, because we love ourselves and we love our life. We love existing in some sense. We love the people that we're able to attach to and the people that have attached to us, and, just the experiences that we've had. And you identify, of course, with it. And then you're afraid of it getting torn apart. And that becomes, it's like a physical wave that crests and then breaks. You're afraid of the wave breaking. But I mean, maybe we've got to go into a break here. Just to wrap it up, you're saying that meaning is made. If you go back to the etymological roots of the word meaning, that's all it ever meant to be. It's to have an opinion, to think something. It's to signify something, to create a sort of internal structure that is supposed to signify your world in some way. It's never, in some sense, we might have elevated it to a station that it was never supposed to fit. And all that we ever wanted from it, all that we should want from it, is it's what we think. It's what it means to us anyway. And ideally, what it means to us is more love than fear. But that's up to the observer. That's up to the interpreter. In any event, we've got to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be back in just a minute.
Fault lines. We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Chuck Zlatkin. He's the legislative and political director for the New York Metro Area Postal Union. That is APWU. Chuck, how are you doing this morning?
I'm okay. How are you gentlemen doing? Thank you for having me on again.
Hey, thank you for joining us on such short notice. For everybody listening, Chuck Zlatkin, legislative and political director for the New York Metro Area Postal Union. Chuck, thank you for being with us. On the other side of the election, mail-in ballots are at the center of what has become practically an international controversy. It's certainly a national controversy, with Trump still contesting the results of the election, still saying he won. Again, a lot of this stuff has to do with mail-in ballots. Not all of it, but a good deal of it. People saying that mail-in ballots as such are a source of the fraud here, that they're liable to fraud. Of course, this all follows. We've had you on for months now talking about the USPS. First under attack by Louis DeJoy, months ago under a longer-term attack, under a sort of long-term siege warfare by the Republican Party as such, as far as I can tell, and by some Democrats too. But Chuck, coming back to the election here, what's your take on how this went down?
Well, considering what the reality was, I have to say that the postal workers did a phenomenal job in getting the ballots first to people and then to the areas that they had to go to be counted. I know there's some, fraud. I don't even know if there's proof of that or whatever, lots of charges of that. But I know what postal workers had to deal with and what they did to make sure that the ballots got where they had to go, was a phenomenal effort. I mean, any problems that existed having to do with the Postal Service, as you mentioned, goes back to Louis DeJoy. I mean, he knew what he was doing. And rather than strengthening, preparing for, he tried, to do what he could to hurt the post office, hurt the speed of the mail or whatever. But I'm totally influenced by the efforts that were made by postal workers, many of whom up until the elections worked 84-hour weeks, making sure that those ballots got out there and whatever. And I guess there's a lesson for the future that if you want to use mail-in ballots, I mean, there are 5 states in this country that you have to vote by mail. And that's it. There's no other way to vote. And in those states, they have phenomenal participation of the population in voting. There's virtually none, or if any, minor cases of fraud. So why not apply that to the rest of the country if it's going to go that way eventually? So I think under the circumstances, the post office and particularly postal workers did a great job. People appreciate it most people appreciate it. I guess getting a certain kind of narrative in some of the news media, but I had the experience, and I have to tell you about tomorrow, but I want to say this first. I had the experience of actually being out on the street in New York City on Saturday, November 7th, when the word came down that they were giving or at least they were saying that Biden won the election. There were people out cheering, whatever, in the streets. Well, whenever a postal truck went by or a postal worker walked by, people just spontaneously started applauding and cheering. I've never seen anything like that in my entire career in the post office. Seeing that, it was amazing. It was totally not expected by me, but it did show at least a part of the population understood what the postal workers went through and what they did. And I just want to take this opportunity to mention that tomorrow, Tuesday, November 17th, it came together quickly, but there's going to be a national day of action to defend the post office and celebrate postal workers. People could go to APWU, that's 4 letters, apwu.org, and they got a map showing where they are all around the country, at least in 25 cities, but more are being added as we go because this thing is happening quickly. Actually, listeners in the New York area, if they want to come and stand with us, we're going to have something at 12 noon in front of the main post office in Manhattan at 8th Avenue and 31st Street, socially distanced, mask wearing, to be out there because the Postal Service at this point, while what took place and the focus is on the ballots, DeJoy's plans for slowing the mail, reducing the service of the Postal Service, well, the court stopped him from a lot of that stuff, but it only went through like November 6th, a couple of cases to January 1st. But he's planning to put in his slowing down the mail and reducing service to the public in the post office immediately. And his intent is supposed to go there. The Postal Service still has the financial crisis that it had brought about by COVID. So DeJoy is going ahead, and we have to stand up because, yes, the ballots were important. The election is important. It's still in contested things to learn, but people still have to receive their medications through the mail. They still have to get important papers, checks, whatever. And DeJoy is intent upon putting in his plans to reduce service to the American people. And he's still the postmaster. If Trump is not the president and Biden comes in, DeJoy is still the postmaster. He was selected by the Postal Board of Governors. He serves at their pleasure, and he's not going anywhere.
Well, Chuck, that's what I was going to ask you. With Biden coming in office, does Biden have any powers at his disposal to either get rid of DeJoy? And on second point, the post office, the day of action that is going to be celebrated tomorrow on Tuesday, is there going to be a specific call for the President of the United States or for Congress to do something? Meaning, it's one thing to go out and kind of make the point that, look, they're attacking us. They're trying to destroy the post office for political and economic reasons. But is there a very specific call, a focus on drawing a spotlight in a circle around Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, and that Congress, in saying you need to defend this and making the American public aware that they are letting it die on the vine?
Well, I mean, the reality is, and it's been happened and it's been coming up for quite some time to get some kind of emergency funding for the Postal Service to get this, get through this COVID period. And that's a direct call to Congress to get funding. And that's something that's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's not independent. Everybody depends upon the Postal Service, and and that's shown the way people are rating. Now, there are 3 and will be 4 vacancies on the Postal Board of Governors. Again, that could be filled. Trump, if he was going out, could make those nominations, or would wait till Biden comes in. Of course, against what the makeup of the Senate will be, because those appointments have to be approved by the Senate. So yes, it's conceivable you could get in 3 or 4 new members of the Postal Board of Governors who could then make policy. And they're the ones who could decide that it would be time to, change the postmaster or institute policy. So that's really, there is potential power there. But then again, it's a question of, if the Republicans keep control of the Senate and McConnell's in there, he has a tremendous amount of influence on power. So again, there's nothing definite. But again, the pressure is there. The pressure is there around the country. People need the Postal Service, desperately, particularly in rural areas, for it to continue serving the public. So at this point, the first call is to get the funding for the post office to get through this period. The second call is to have, leadership of the Postal Service that's going to, deliver what the public needs. I mean, it's a very simple dynamic here. People need the Postal Service, and therefore it needs to be able to continue the way it's been functioning, not have it, cut back and reduce service hours and reduce the scheduling of mail and whatever. I mean, the joy is he's a very talented guy. It's just that he's come in there not to strengthen the Postal Service or save the Postal Service. He's in there to prepare for eventual privatization. And he knew very well when he came in with a 91% approval rating by the American people, privatization would have been very difficult. But if you can get people to lose confidence in the post office and lose faith because the Postal Service isn't meeting their needs, then it becomes a little, easier. So that's what tomorrow was about. It's about getting funding, but it's also making sure, putting pressure on Congress and the president and whoever it is, that the Postal Service is needed by the American people. Now, when Biden,
Chuck, we've only got a minute here left. Here's what I want to get to. Oh no, you're totally good. 2 last quick questions. One, who would you look to in terms of people in Congress, politicians in Congress, for some support here? And then 2, what are the details on the event tomorrow? Again, where can people go to learn more? What are the time, the places, all that stuff? Chuck.
Well, Gary Peters. I mean, there are numbers of people in Congress who understand, knowledgeable about what's going on in the Postal Service, and they've been trying to get legislation to help it through. So there is leadership. Both parties have strong support, and we've seen it in the past. So it's doable and it's possible. There is the leadership there. It's just a question of pressure and people identifying that. So tomorrow, at least in 25 cities, probably by now more, there's going to be a day of action to defend the post office and also celebrate postal workers. To go to the map and find out where the location is nearest you, go to APWU, that's 4 letters, APWU.org, and you can go there and plug in for an area near you, come out, for a short time and be counted that you care about the post office and you're demanding that it continues to serve the American people.
Chuck, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you for having me.
Yeah, for those listening, Chuck Zlatkin is the legislative and political director for New York, the New York metro area postal union. That's APWU. And again, they have an event coming up tomorrow. If you want to support the post office, postal service, USPS, go to apwu.org. And I think that's totally worth it. I mean, Jamarl, something I've seen with this is, as we've been showing, in advance of the election, they've been trying to delegitimize the Postal Service, and largely in order to privatize it. But it also seems like it works the other way around. Now that you've undermined the results of the election, if you could chalk that up to the Postal Service being at fault, if you can blame them for it, then you can hit both sides. It's sort of a double-edged sword in the useful sense for the powers that be. In any event, we've got to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seasoned political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know, it's funny, after having like a 20-minute conversation about meaning and propaganda, to then say propaganda, it just feels weird. But let's get to some headlines. In the news, after the first final states were called on Friday, with Georgia going to Biden and North Carolina going to Trump, Trump tweeted early Sunday that he, quote, concedes nothing, unquote, before tweeting late Sunday night that the Constitution has been shattered and violated by the election and that he won the election, defiant as ever. In December on Saturday, the pro-Trump, quote, Million MAGA March, unquote, was predictably marred by violence as the Proud Boys and Antifa continued to fight as the day wore on during the event. Trump called Antifa, quote, Antifa scum, repeatedly on Twitter. This is so weird. This is so bizarre to me. I am reading, well, a few books, but The German War, I just finished up. Love that book. I've read that book twice. One of the weird parts, going back then, and I hate making these allegories or these comparisons, but I'm making the comparison only because I was just reading the book, where you have these groups fighting in streets. They would have street fights constantly. You would have like all of these political wings have their own fighting wings. And these paramilitaries, whether it was, you know, the communists, the Nazis, the people who were more authoritarian, these guys used to go fighting in the streets. It was so bizarre. And you look at this and you wonder, you know, is this kind of a neo version of that? Or like a minor version of that? How bizarre. You have two ruling sovereigns. Neither concedes. Biden, I would say, has some more legitimacy to it. But, and I'm asking you this, Shane, is there any possible fashion that you can conceive of Donald Trump conceding at this point? Whether it's ego, whether it's not just wanting to concede, believing, yeah, they'll escort me out, I don't have to concede. But do you see any situation where Donald Trump says, okay, you're right, I lost?
At this point, no.
Yeah, neither do I. Neither do I. And that's greatly unfortunate. And this gets to what we were talking about, this kind of downward spiral. And when Biden comes in, do you think that they are going to be loving and forgiving to Joe Biden, or do you think they're going to try to make Joe Biden a one-term president? Shane.
Sorry about that. I think they'll try to make. It's what they always try to do. The Republicans will try to make Joe Biden a one-term president because every party is going to try to make the opposite's party. If there's an incumbent, they're going to try to unseat that incumbent. That's just how they do it. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of people are wondering, will Biden survive? Is the 25th Amendment going to come into effect here? You know, neither of us know the answer to that question. God forbid that actually happens, because that would be just frankly a national tragedy. Just per se, yeah. You don't want that. Again, this is a problem. And in the same sense that if the head of state fails to transition to the next head of state and you have a breakdown of democracy as usual, if the head of state dies, that's even sharper. That's even sharper. And I'm sure that they have contingency plans within contingency plans to anticipate that and to capitalize on that. With Kamala coming in, of course, but that's still not a good thing. It's still not good. And what would be especially bad is that for so many people that was foreseen as a potential conclusion. I'm getting ahead of myself, of course. That hasn't happened. It probably won't, but we'll see. Anyway, Jamarl, back to you.
Yeah, this stuff is just up in the air. Yeah. Interregnum. Who rules? Biden's incoming chief of staff, Ron Klain, has called for an immediate transition, asking the Trump administration Sunday to reverse course and begin working on a presidential transition this week. The federal government has not yet gotten any key determination from the General Service Administration that would allow agencies to begin to cooperate with the transition, which Klain said on NBC News, Meet the Press, has left the Biden team unable to speak to current administration officials or begin planning on how to take over during the crisis that has killed more than 240,000 people in America alone. The Gray Zone last week reported that Biden's appointees at the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Richard Stengel, highlighting his support for the use of propaganda against American citizens. Rick Stengel was the longest-serving Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in U.S. history. Quote, "My old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as chief propagandist," unquote, Stengel said in 2018. Quote, "I am not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it in their own populations, and I don't necessarily think it's all that awful," unquote. Rick needs to find a better word for that, because in America that has a very clear denotion in regards to what it means. He's right.
I think he's just being contrarian there.
But he's right.
He's right.
He's completely right. And yet,
the
American public is going to cringe at that. But he's right.
Here's the thing.
Why does American public cringe at that word? Even though he's right.
We used it all the time.
Exactly,
we used it all the time against authoritarians. That's because we painted any form of state media by the fascists and the communist governments in the last century as propaganda, effectively. I mean, when you have like major ideological blocks, post-printing press, post the advent of ideology as such, and you have this competition between great powers, and you have a democratized public that's consuming a bunch of information and that's supposed to prop up those governments by its consumption of information, particularly in the case of the democracies, then what you get is the creation of this term propaganda, which is really just, we use the term propaganda when our information rubs up against somebody else's. When you have a conflict between two competing narratives.
Yeah, it's like a terrorist. It's like that guy's a freedom fighter and that guy's a terrorist. It's almost relative depending upon who you are, where what you're trying to aim at. I'm fascinated by that little blurb for some reason. That little blurb blows me away because there's so much in it. It's like, that guy's right, but even though he's right, why would the American public cringe? All of those type of things come in, and then you get into this kind of philosophical thing of what does propaganda mean? That is a great quote, great headline, great headline. Officials in the United States have reported more than 11 million total cases of COVID-19 as of Sunday, as cases passed 10 million just a week ago, and more than 1 in 400 Americans have tested positive since. At least 623 new COVID deaths and 135,187 new cases were reported in the United States on November 15th. Over the past week, there have been an average of 150,265 cases per day, an increase of 81% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday morning, more than 11,112,800 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus, and at least 246,000 have died. Wow. On Sunday, Peru's interim president, Manuel Merino, stepped down only 5 days after he assumed that post. Merino was president of Congress until being appointed interim president after Congress impeached the former president, Martin Vizcarra, over corruption allegations on Monday. Vizcarra has denied the allegations. Vizcarra's impeachment sparked protests across the country starting Monday and continued for 6 days in a row, leaving at least 2 people dead and 94 injured on Saturday night. 15 nations have signed on to the largest trade deal in the world. The signatories include 30% of the world's population and GDP and reach 2.2 billion consumers. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is made up of 10 Southeast Asian countries, as well as South Korea, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The deal excludes the United States, which withdrew from the rival Asia-Pacific Trade Pact in 2017 under Trump. That basically is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are questions on whether or not Joe Biden will try to get back to that. And I strongly suspect that this deal that China is coming up with, that is bringing all of these countries together, are probably in direct repudiation of the TPP, which was going to do something similar by excluding China and Russia and sewing up a lot of the world's trade. The difference is China has, it seems to be anyway, much more of a principle of win-win as opposed to this notion of dominance within the way that they do their trade deals. So this is a big deal, and this is going to have massive effects, I think, in regards to this notion of trying to push forth the Belt and Road Initiative, or for that matter, trying to push back on U.S. hegemony in regards to trade. So, yeah, great deal. Several rockets have hit near airports in Eritrea's capital of Asmara. The rockets were fired from Ethiopia's Tigray region. 5 diplomats have said as a conflict between governmental forces and a separatist group spilled beyond Ethiopia's borders. At least 2 of the rockets hit Asmara's airport on Saturday evening, 3 of the diplomats said. However, the United States Embassy contradicted those reports, saying that there were no indications the airport was struck. Nevertheless, it did confirm reports of a series of loud noises in the vicinity and told U.S. citizens in Eritrea to remain in their homes on Sunday. The move threatens to precipitate a wider conflict in the Horn of Africa that was heretofore been a conflict restricted to Ethiopia's borders as President Abiy Ahmed contests for political control of Tigray's People Liberation Front. Man, I would love to be a fly on the wall there. Shane, I'm always fascinated by that type of stuff. Issues of war, politics, and all of those things. We need to get somebody on for this, or at the very least, send somebody like myself there to talk to people. It's so strange when you get into these tribal conflicts. You know, it's like when you, for example, when you go to Kenya, everybody's black. So, you know, it's not like this racial conflict. But instead, you have conflict against tribes. And you have various tribes that have these kind of political identities that come into contests. And so you have like this.
I don't.
Go for it.
I don't know if I would use the word tribal here. I mean, it seems like they have a pretty consolidated national identity.
I'm talking about Kenya.
Specifically the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
No. I was saying Kenya. I was just saying that in conflicts in the West, oftentimes this boils down to like racial lines. When I was in Kenya, it was tribal lines. And in this case, you have what seems to be this kind of regional conflict of a province that apparently has weapons that are attacking. No, man, I'm fascinated by all this stuff. We need to get somebody on to have a conversation in regards to what is going on. Why is Tigray doing this? How did they get heavy weapons? Meaning, like, you know, it's a province per se. So how does this province get heavy weapons? Like, all of these things become questions in regards to conflict. Ahmed got the Nobel Peace Prize, and now these guys are conflict.
Well, that was for the war with Eritrea, and I mean, again, this is threatening to bring Eritrea in with Tigray sending rockets in as of this weekend. I thought that Netfa Freeman on last Wednesday, he gave a pretty solid overview of the conflict, and you know we're talking about that for a little bit, but it would be good to talk with somebody on the ground.
Yeah, he was
talk with somebody.
Yeah, he was
reporting that.
He gave a phenomenal explanation of this. I don't know. I'm enamored by politics, especially international or at home. And war is a politics in and of itself in an odd way. SpaceX launched 4 astronauts to the International Space Station on Sunday on its first full-fledged taxi flight for NASA by a private company. The Dragon capsule on top, named Resilience by its crew in light of the year's many challenges, most notably COVID-19, reached orbit 9 minutes later. It is due to reach space station late Monday and remain there until spring. Quote, by working together through these difficult times, you've inspired the nation, the world, and in no small part, the name of this incredible vehicle, Resilience. Unquote. Commander Mike Hopkins said right before liftoff. Once reaching orbit, he radioed, "That was one heck of a ride." Sidelined by the coronavirus himself, SpaceX founder and chief executive Elon Musk was forced to monitor the action from afar. He tweeted that he most likely had a moderate case of COVID-19. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know, that was, I watched a picture of that, and it was this light that goes from the ground to the sky in this arc. It is a beautiful picture to watch. You don't even see the capsule. You just see a blazing trail of light. It's beautiful. And, you know, this gets across technical acumen. We're apes. You know, basically, it's this Space 2000 thing, 2001. The ape throws up a bone and it becomes a space station. And the transition meaning this ape learns how to use a tool by bashing another ape in the head. And that tool, hammer, baton, whatever you want to call it, is exactly the same mechanism that allowed them to basically create a space station, or in this case, throw things into orbit. I don't know. It's a religious experience to me. to see stuff like this. It's hard to put it into words. And my only hedge is that it is a profitable enterprise. That's my only hedge. It's like, do I really want capitalism in space? And when you look at shows like The Expanse and these other type of shows, is that really, is that dystopian, or is that really the world that you want? I don't know. What do you think, Shane? I mean, we need to, go into the next segment, but what do you think?
We should go into the next segment. Broadly, there's a whole conversation about corporate versus private. Corporate versus public ownership of space. Yeah. What that even means. What ownership of space, frankly, means. And then there are these, for all the conversation we can have about it, there's the conversation about where where the sort of weight of incentives is going to carry us anyway. And I admit there's a bit of dystopia there. Yeah. I don't like it. Anyway, we got to go into a break. Thanks for doing headlines tomorrow. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we will be back in just a minute with a few members of Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle. Again, back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guests, a new guest and an old one. We got Peter Lavelle, and I believe I just want to do a quick mic check here. It's Chara Haley, right? That's how I pronounce that?
It's actually Kira.
Kira, thank you so much. I will remember that duly. Anyway, for those listening, Kira Haley is a TV producer, writer, and YouTuber with Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, currently residing in Moscow. We also have Peter Lavelle, American journalist, host of Crosstalk on RT, and co-founder/host of his new political commentary show, Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle. By the way, follow Kira on Twitter at Kira J. Haley. That's CIARAJHALEY. Bunch of letters there, but Kira J. Haley. You can also follow her on Twitter at PL Crosstalk. What was that? Pardon me. I thought I heard one of you guys trying to cut in here. Thank you both for joining us. How are you both doing this morning?
Well, it's afternoon for us.
Yeah, it is afternoon and very well on this quite cold afternoon, actually, in Moscow. It's turned quite cold this week.
It has out here as well. I'm in South Dakota. It is morning here, definitely not afternoon, and I'm admittedly carrying that overseas a bit. But getting cold. It is heading towards winter. In any event, thank you both for joining us. I just started off like this. New York Times, as always, covering Trump extremely critically, as with the rest of the establishment media, frankly, labeling him a dictator. I admit some guests on this show have labeled him as such as well. I'll just start here. A lot of this, it's not just the follow-on of 4 years of the same. It's also his take on the election, not conceding the election, despite the media claiming that Biden has won, claiming that Biden is now the president-elect. I'll just start like this. Is Trump a dictator? Peter?
Go ahead, Kira, because we did a video on this. Go ahead. Kira, are you there? All right, I'll jump in here. If Trump's a dictator, then he's got to be the weakest, worst dictator in history. A dictator would not allow any kind of free speech. A dictator wouldn't allow any form of dissent. A dictator would put his political opponents in prison. So this is stupid. It's simply stupid to say such a thing. I mean, this is just juvenile. It's ridiculous. And not conceding the race. Well, let's vote. Let's count all the votes first. I mean, there are deadlines here. There are mechanisms here. Why is everyone's hair on fire? Let's let the votes be certified. Let the electors sit down and vote, and then we will know exactly, officially, legally, who the next president of the United States is. Calm down, everyone.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think part of it is hysteria. I think part of it is that Democrats are screaming, "Oh my God, Donald Trump is, he's going to do X or he's going to do Y."
He's done none.
Yeah,
none of these.
But that's political casting. I mean, that's basically what it is. And I think part of it too is that in this country we have such a tradition of conceding. So, Mitt Romney didn't write a presidential speech, but definitely conceded the race after he realized Obama won. So it's weird to have this type of refusal. That's all. I mean, it's just, it breaks norms. That's all. But Trump has continuously broke norms. So that's neither here nor there. I don't buy the dictator stuff either.
Who's breaking norms? Who's breaking the norms?
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kira.
Something in there. I think a big part of the mess we now find ourselves in is caused exactly by the fact that the media jumped the gun on this. And not only did it jump the gun, it prematurely, I'm talking about the mainstream media outlets here, but prematurely declared a winner. And even before the voting was counted, a lot of people were making their speculations known in a very finite way when it's not finite.
Well, to add on to what Kira just said there, okay, breaking norms, that's what's being said here. Well, certainly not in 2016. Maybe in 2012, you had a little bit more of a semblance of balance in the media. Now, in 2016, all of the stations, all the cable stations made a fortune off of Donald Trump. And then you had 4 years of legitimizing him. And in 2020, the race was called before the first ballot was cast. So who's breaking the norms here? Okay, I find it absurd, this kind of conversation. It's the mainstream media and the establishment that have broken all of the norms. You have impeachment without any kind of violation of the law. You have 4 years investigating the president without a predicate. And I'm not even a Trump supporter.
No, Peter, you're right. You're absolutely right. I don't deny any of that. None. I'm just saying a president, if you're asking, why are they being this way? Why are they being this hysterical? The reason is that a president typically concedes. That's the only reason why. I mean, think back for a moment. Is there any other situation? And I agree with you. So it's saying both things are true at once. Let me ask you this. I'm curious. You guys are in Moscow. How is Moscow covering this now? Like, meaning the political or the media scene in Moscow when they're talking about this election and this kind of weird thing that is happening in American politics over the last 4 years. How did the media in Moscow cover that?
Kira, I think I would just say those crazy Americans again. Okay, I mean, it's this political theater and circus. But the foreboding, if Biden is going to go back to a Obama foreign policy, then of course there's a dark foreboding here. But let me make it clear to all of our listeners is that it doesn't matter who's in the White House. They're going to be viciously anti-Russian. It doesn't matter what political party is in the White House.
Well, Peter, just to add what you say, to give an actual figure to what Russians think, there was a poll released, and the question was, who did Russians support in the presidential election? This is according to the pollster of the Levada Center, which is one of the only independent pollsters that you have access to here. 16% of respondents supported Trump, 9% supported Biden, and 65% said that they didn't care. I think that's pretty representative.
That's good. Yep, I agree.
And in some sense, that's what you would expect. I mean, different countries. Weirdly enough, I think Americans care too much about whether or not Vladimir Putin gets reelected, simply because we've had year after year after year, almost decades at this point, of villainization of him. So we know more about him. It's interesting, though. I think again for Americans to hear that, maybe counterintuitive for some. Just because you would think, okay, they're the Russians. We've made a sort of boogeyman out of the Russians as such. We have vilified them, not just Putin. Yeah. And you'd expect, again, as a sort of normal American citizen listening to MSNBC or CNN, that the Russians would have a stake in this, but they don't. They're their own country. Another side of this. Go for it, Peter.
Say here, because it's very important here. There is a difference in media landscape. There's something called Inosmi here. And what they do is an organization that translates foreign media into Russian. So, and our good friend Dmitry Babich works there. And Russians are, if you're interested in politics, have much more awareness of what's going on in the United States than Americans know what's going on in Russia. It's really lopsided. So, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, it's translated into Russian. And people that are interested in politics can have a really good insight. And those people that do that understand the really gross hostility from the political and media establishments towards their own country.
Wow, that would have to be very weird. I would imagine that's very bizarre. Like especially if you're looking at our media. I'm sorry, go ahead, Kiara. I'm sorry.
If you take it from a global perspective, I think the last 4 years have been very formative in the degradation of international opinion towards American policy and American politics in general. I don't know if we expand this beyond Russia and you look at Irish opinion or you look at English opinion, there's been a very sharp decline in trust of the US democratic system, criticism towards the presidential candidates across the board. And I think the last 4 years have cemented a global decline in admiration or respect for US politics.
I would absolutely agree with that, okay? Because Americans don't understand is that people do pay attention because the United States is the global hegemon, so people have to pay attention to it. But the US doesn't pay attention to what's going on outside the world, outside their own borders, very, very rarely. And so Americans have a very myopic view of world politics. And it's Sputnik, it's like Google, the gaggle, crosstalk. We try to educate audiences as if they want to be educated about how the world sees the U.S.
What would you chalk that up to? I mean, for the establishment media in the U.S., I'm sure that they would pin that all on Trump having become president, having sort of pulled back in some sense from our traditional diplomatic agreements and arrangements. But I'm guessing that there's more, and I can't help but think that Russiagate, not just Trump, but the demonization of Trump and the perceived breakdown of the American political system as such, not due to Trump, but with Trump partly as a symptom of that breakdown. I'm guessing that's part of it too, but what's your take?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump didn't invent foreign inventions around the world. As a matter of fact, I would credit him for not starting a new one. And he did desperately and is desperately trying to wind down some foreign wars. Kudos to him. But see, it's not because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump just pulled the veil for everyone to see how corrupt the political elites are. And that's creating a new coalition within the United States, which obviously is a different conversation from this one. But Trump just showed with more clarity how the U.S. operates and how hypocritical, for example, its foreign policy is. You export democracy by force. The vast majority of people around the world think that's a nonsensical thing to do. But it's not a credibly debated issue within the American political elite.
Well, not just not debated, it's accepted as normal. Like when we go into another country dropping bombs, it's just kind of assumed that we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. Like you say, it's a nonsense perspective anywhere else outside of the world. I'm sorry, Kiara, please finish.
Sorry. I feel like I'm maybe a bit delayed here in my connection, but...
No, that's my fault. I'm sorry. It was just a delay in it. I'm sorry. Please finish.
I think it also is related to general decline in trust of the media at large. And I say this from the perspective of people becoming aware of fake news. That was a massive hashtag, Twitter platforms. You have so many thoughts and feelings projected upon the internet now that people turn to their internet rather than they have, the TV channels where they watch news channels. That's long gone now. And people go to find their own truth on the internet, which they come to their own conclusions. And a lot of those conclusions have led to a lot of mistrust of media outlets. Donald Trump himself has blamed all of this by long accusing, MBSC and MBS and what's the one, and SBC and all these mainstream media outlets on the left. He's been declaring they produce fake news for his entire presidency, and at the same time, on the right side, you have like Fox News and all the main cable channels who also have come under fire for producing and perpetuating fake news, which I think is also another reason why people are now critical and using their own minds to find out information, truth, whatever form that may be. At least they're trying. But I think mistrust alongside the presidency with Donald Trump and media outlets has caused a lot of the problems that we see now.
Ditto.
Yeah, very cool. You guys, the voice that you guys were listening to, Peter Lavelle, Kira Haley. Kira Haley is TV producer, writer, and YouTuber with The Gaggle and is currently residing in Moscow. You can follow Kira on Twitter at Kira J. Haley and Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, now airing on YouTube. And by the way, Peter Lavelle is an American journalist, host of Crosstalk on RT, and co-founder, host of his brand new political commentary show, Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment. And Kara, I apologize for interrupting. It really was a delay. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower, and you can follow him on Twitter at Real Scott Ritter. Scott, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yourself?
Good. Yeah, better for having you again. Thank you for being with us. We're talking about your recent article on RT. I'm going to just read the title of the article so folks can find it. No, Trump's firing of Defense Secretary Mark Esper doesn't mean there's going to be a military coup in the U.S., quote unquote. Again, an article you wrote up, I believe, last Tuesday, early last week, over on RT.com. And we've been talking about this on the show, replacing Mark Esper with Christopher Miller, and under him with Doug MacArthur as Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense. I was a speculation about what's going on here. When he did this, New York Times and other mainstream sort of establishment media outlets were all hammering Trump for planning an alleged coup. That was at least what they were intimating, but it was stated pretty explicitly a number of times. And then there was just this general sort of dark atmosphere around these accusations. That's what a lot of they were talking about. I was thinking maybe preparation for a withdrawal from Afghanistan. There might be more than meets the eye here. But Scott, what's your take? Why did he do this?
I think that definitely it wasn't for a coup. I mean, the thing that triggered me was Andrew Weissman of Mueller special prosecutor fame or infamy, put out a tweet that basically blocked the Esper firing and the Miller hiring as just as a step towards a coup, towards setting the military up to somehow intervene in a way that kept Donald Trump in power in an unconstitutional manner. And as somebody who spent a good deal of time in the Marine Corps and who had taken the oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, and understands how important that oath is to anybody who wears the uniform. I just took serious umbrage at Weissman, who never wore the uniform, by the way. Yes, I know he took an oath as a special prosecutor, which he violated numerous times with Enron, with his prosecution of a senator in Alaska, and I believe with what he was doing with Mueller. This is a man who wouldn't know the Constitution to hit him in the face, or at least wouldn't know how to uphold the Constitution. But I took umbrage at that. But then, after I wrote the article, as the the story unfolded, we now have the introductory memorandum from Christopher Miller to the Pentagon, which pretty much says it's time to wind these wars down. It's time to get out of here, and it feels as if he's been given a preparatory order from President Trump that we're going to be pulling the plug, and you see a lot of other people jumping ship now, and we can call their service honorable, whatever you want to say, but they're part of an establishment that has kept the United States in Afghanistan and into the Middle East for almost 20 years now, and in a war that we can't win, in a war that we're not winning, in a war that we're not going to win, and Trump, I think, is recognizing that you can't rely on the establishment to do the right thing. The establishment is geared towards starting a war and continuing the war. It's not geared towards finishing a war and getting out of a war or preventing war. And so he's starting to put in people who are of a like mind of his to shut down these forever wars. And I think that's what we're seeing in the Pentagon. I think we're seeing not a constitutional crisis in the making, but rather the deconstruction of an establishment built for perpetual war. It'll probably just be a temporary deconstruction because, as we know, probably on January 20th, a new administration will come in, Joe Biden, and he's surrounding himself with the very establishment types that Donald Trump is deconstructing. So it's going to be a little glimmer of positivity when it comes to American militarism that'll come to a crashing halt sometime in the middle of January. But at least for a while, hopefully, we can bring the boys and girls home, and we can shut down these wars that otherwise would just literally never end.
Scott, what are the hedges for a president to pull his troops out? I mean, Donald Trump has been saying he wanted to get those troops out of Afghanistan, out of Syria, all of these places for a while. In Syria, he did do, I guess, some level of a drawdown, or at the very least move the troops around, but he decided to steal the oil. And so keeping a few, or at the very least paying terrorists to maintain the oil fields. What are the hedges, though? Because Donald Trump has been saying this for a while, that would stop him from doing exactly what he wanted to do, even to the point of needing to put in people to pull this policy off. Why couldn't he pull this policy off with the people who are already in place? He's the president of the United States.
Because they lied to him. I mean, we already know this. We know that the outgoing special envoy for Syria has acknowledged that not only himself, but the military lied to the president about the numbers of troops in Syria and what the troops are actually doing in Syria. The president for a while was led to believe that we had 200 troops. The number's actually classified, but I believe it fluctuates between 900 and closer to 2,000, depending on whatever nefarious mission the military is running at the time, which they haven't been totally honest with the president about. The same thing with Afghanistan, where the president is told over and over again, about certain force structures, but they lied to him because we have a whole covert force structure. We have troops that rotate in on a temporary basis in perpetuity, which means they're not temporary. We just pretend that they're temporary, so we don't count those numbers. The military has lied to this president for years. This is why, again, it's interesting. Bob Woodward wrote the book Rage, and he gave a couple interviews based upon the recorded telephone conversations he had with the president. And Woodward and others were very critical of Donald Trump for calling the generals losers. I mean, how dare he call these honorable men who have 4 stars on their shoulders losers? But he doesn't tell the backstory of how when Trump came in, the military, he said, what are we doing about Afghanistan? The military said, hey, if you just give us what we need, we can win this war. He said, what do you need? More troops. You got more troops. What do you need? More money. You got more money. What do you need? We need to loosen up our rules of engagement so we can take it to the enemy. Loosen them up. Fact is, I'm going to give you the authority to launch attacks when you need it. You don't have to bring it to the White House anymore. And after a year, he called him in and he said, how's it going? He said, well, we need more troops. He turned to him and he said, you guys are the biggest bunch of losers in the world. I gave you everything you said you need, and you can't win a war. You don't know how to win a war. You don't want to win a war. You're a bunch of losers. I'm better at this than you are because I'm going to just say, let's get out of here. Most honest thing a commander-in-chief has said to the military about their role ever in modern history, because no other president has the guts to sit there and stare these generals in the face and call them what they are, losers, because that's what you are when you can't win a war, especially when you had nearly 20 years to do it. And yet the military lies to him. They because this is about this. We've turned Afghanistan and the Middle East into a career machine. And what that means is, in order for you to get promoted now, you have to do your pump into Afghanistan. You have to do your tour. You have to get your package. The package, of course, are the medals and the badges, the accoutrements of combat that you get to put on your chest and then walk around and say, I am I'm a proven combat leader now. That's what the military has become. It's a fake machine because it's not real combat. I mean, I'm not belittling it. People die, but it's counterinsurgency warfare. It's low intensity. Our military has forgotten how to fight a real war. We couldn't stand up against a peer or near peer opponent today and prevail. If we're talking about confronting Russia and Europe with what? With an army that doesn't know how to fight anymore because all they've learned how to do is kick down doors in villages and shoot unarmed women and children, or hunt down poorly armed insurgents in a mountain using, $2 trillion worth of weaponry to take out an insurgent carrying a rifle worth $122. I mean, that's just stupidity, but that's what our military has become. And Trump has called it out. But it's hard to go against the machine. It's hard to go against an establishment when they don't tell you the truth, when the Espers of the world or the Mattises of the world or the Mileys of the world all sit down and blow smoke at you, and you don't know what's really going on. So how can you make a decision if you don't have all the facts at your table? So Trump's cleaning house now, and it's politically risky. You say, why didn't he do this before? Because it's a huge political risk. Could you imagine the field day, the media, the mainstream media would have had if Trump had done this in the lead up to the election? He's firing his generals. He's preparing for a coup. I mean, all the nonsense we hear now would have been magnified even more. Trump can do it right now because I think even he recognizes he's a lame duck president. This is it. And there are no political consequences. He's already paid the political price. He lost an election. He has between now and January 20th.
Isn't it less risky at this point? Isn't he doing it because it's less risky? Just holding that idea for a minute, because it's going to have less of an impact. Like you were saying, it's in the last couple of months here, presumably, unless somehow he's able to shake out a victory from this thing through these lawsuits, through the Supreme Court potentially, unless he's able to get a second term. Isn't this just of incredibly limited impact? I get where you're going with it, and frankly, I agree. I think this kind of thing should have been done years ago. I agree with it on a deep level, but what's it actually going to do, Scott?
Well, it's going to get us out of Afghanistan. I mean, we're at the point right now where troop productions are at this critical margin. We keep talking about wanting to keep special forces in Afghanistan to hunt down terrorism. And this will be a forever perpetuity. It'll never end because there will always be something we will call a terrorist in the vicinity of Afghanistan. But in order to keep those guys in, we have to keep a certain amount of conventional military power. We have to keep the air power, the helicopters. We have to keep the quick reaction forces, the conventional forces. So we need, 5,000-6,000 troops in Afghanistan forever. And if Trump can bring that number down, pop it down to around $2,000, then the rest have to leave because 2,000 troops in Afghanistan is an unsustainable number. Can't be sustained in the long term. And so there will be a point of no return where it's virtually irreversible. And I think he's trying to reach that point before he leaves. So no matter what Biden wants, he won't be able to get it. The same thing with Syria. Syria is just a matter of pulling the plug. I mean, frankly speaking, we can pull the plug. The troops will be out within a week. There's nothing that will keep us in there besides us. There's no government in Syria that we're working with. We've already screwed the Kurds. The Turks are doing their own thing. So we can literally just get out of Syria anytime we want with zero, major ramifications. Iraq is the same thing. I mean, the bottom line is we're staring a loaded shotgun in the face through the pro-Iranian militias who right now have a tentative ceasefire because the parliament said we want the troops out. And they said if the Americans pull them out, we'll stop attacking them. And Trump understands the reality of this, that to keep the Americans in Iraq today, there's no viable anti-ISIS mission. It's purely an anti-Iran mission, which doesn't have any congressional authority, which Trump doesn't have the heart in to pursue. And so you just make American troops targets. That's all they are.
Scott, we've got to go into a break. Targets. Fascinating conversation. A bunch of branches here. We can talk about the individual engagements, long-term occupations by America of those three countries, what they're for, like you were getting into at the end. But regardless, we're going into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines, talking with Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. Again, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this break in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And our guest for this segment, Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. We're talking about Trump's changes over in the Pentagon, changing out the defense in the White House, technically, but presiding over the Pentagon, changing out the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Again, this was called by the establishment media, by the New York Times and others, preparations for a coup like we're talking about. It seems like it might be preparations for a pullout, specifically of Afghanistan, although there are hopes waiting in the wings that Syria and a complete withdrawal from Iraq will follow. Here's the thing, Scott, quick question here. Back in July, the House Armed Services Committee voted overwhelmingly in favor of an amendment that was jointly sponsored by Dick Cheney's daughter to prohibit the expenditure of money to reduce the number of U.S. troops deployed in Afghanistan below 8,000. So you're talking about we need to get below 2,000. They're basically keeping us from getting below 8,000. They're saying that in order for that money to be provided, you'd have to prove that the withdrawal would not, quote, increase the risk for the expansion of existing or formation of new terrorist safe havens inside Afghanistan, end quote, or would, quote, not compromise or otherwise negatively affect the ongoing United States counterterrorism mission against the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and associated forces, end quote. Now, there's one comment you could briefly make here, which is that we have been supporting the Islamic State through supporting ISIS affiliates in Syria. So on its face, this is a little bit paradoxical that was good for one country apparently isn't good for the other. Admittedly, we shouldn't be funding them in either. We shouldn't be doing anything in either, but I'm just throwing that in there. Again, here's the thing. We got a couple of months here. Trump has previously said that he wants to withdraw by Christmas, but Congress is undoubtedly going to go against him. Even though he's changing out the heads of the Pentagon, I don't see the Pentagon, the body of the Pentagon, going with him. What's your take? Can he actually do this, or is this just a shot in the dark here, Scott?
No, he can do it. First of all, the congressional action just simply requires a report. They don't have a veto authority over squat. They've just put on a requirement, a rider that says the president has to provide, they say proof or guarantees. It's just a report. So all the president has to do is tune up a ream of paper, throw it at Congress, check off the box, say I fulfilled my requirement here, and now we're pulling the troops out. The Congress, can review it, they can complain, but they can't say he's violated, the intent of Congress or whatever, and it will happen. I think what you're seeing right now is Trump's in a firing mood. Again, one of the problems you have is every time somebody resigns in protest, the media picks it up and runs with it. And that's why, Trump didn't clean house beforehand. Plus, it's very disruptive to the military. But I don't think he cares right now. And I just think that basically, if Miller can get this steamroller moving, anybody who tries to get in its way will literally be fired. I can see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff being cashiered. I can see anybody with 4 stars who says no being cashiered. I can see anybody who's a political appointee who hiccups cashiered. So, it's just a matter right now of political will. Can the president do this? Absolutely. Will he do it? I think he's trying. And we'll just see. Again, if he has the political will, and I think by getting rid of Esper and putting in these people who are similarly inclined, he can get it done. It'll be a bloodbath. There will be a lot of people fired, but American troops can come home. There's literally the only thing stopping them is the amount of flights we can fly into Afghanistan, load up, and fly out.
Scott, if we pull out, this people, especially neocons, always make the argument that what is going to fill the gaps of America receding is going to be antagonistic to American interests. Should we care that what fills the gap is antagonistic to American interests? And will it be antagonistic? Meaning, us being in the countries, are we creating our monsters to such a degree that us pulling out gives us a better outcome from a foreign policy standpoint politically?
We went into Afghanistan in 2001 after 9/11, and we did a lot of really stupid things. We, first of all, declared war on the Taliban, which fundamental error, because the Taliban, and I'm not sitting here promoting the Taliban as the most wonderful people on the planet. They're not, but what they are is a reflection of a majority of the Pashto tribal mentality that exists in Afghanistan. It's not the United States' role to come in and try and do social transformation in Afghanistan. It's not our role to go into Afghanistan and make Western-style suffrage a reality. It's not our role to go in there and redefine the relationship between Islam and secular society. And yet that's what we've tried to do and failed for the last nearly 20 years. We've built up this straw man argument that, if we withdraw from Afghanistan, Afghanistan will fail. No, what we're saying is if we withdraw from Afghanistan, the false vision of Afghanistan that we've tried to construct will fail. Well, guess what? It's always going to fail. It will never succeed. The fact of the matter is Afghanistan will only succeed when Afghanistan decides it wants to succeed, and you have to give them a chance. I do believe that the world has changed since 2001, and when the Taliban come into power, and I say that as conclusively and decisively as I can, because they will come back to power. They've never been defeated. They are the dominant force in Afghanistan today. I think they recognize that there will have to be changes to the way they govern. This isn't a bunch of Talib running around hanging corrupt warlords is what occurred when they were founded. Afghanistan has progressed somewhat. There is more infrastructure, and I think the Taliban have realized that in addition to promoting Islamic fundamentalism, they have to govern, and govern requires compromise. So I do think we'll see a changed Afghanistan. It won't be the Afghanistan that we've tried to artificially create, but it will be a real Afghanistan that has a real chance of success if we just get out of the way and let it happen. We are the problem, not the Taliban. We are the problem.
Scott, we only got a couple minutes left, and I kind of want to change topics in those last couple of minutes. But just to wrap up briefly here, you were saying earlier the American military does not know how to win a war. I think that's frankly because if you win a war, then you can't continue fighting that war. And what our whole industrial complex is built on, our whole the Millen complex is built on fighting wars. It's built on continuing those wars. If you win them, you got to stop fighting them. And of course, for the economic interest at play here, that's a problem. Also, another brief wrap up note. Trump yesterday, we're talking about a whiter purge of pro-militarist elements within the Pentagon. Trump yesterday on Twitter calling, and I'm going to quote here, John Bolton, quote, one of the dumbest people in government that I've had the pleasure to work with, a sullen, dull, and quiet guy. He added nothing to national security except, gee, let's go to war, end quote. I'm sure that's pretty satisfying for a lot of sort of pro-Trump, anti-military supporters to hear. That was sure nice. Another thing, just briefly, last thing here, you were commenting on this, how the envoy to Syria, the ambassador to Syria, Jim Jeffrey, was hiding the numbers, and he was specifically talking about how they were hiding the numbers. The local military was hiding the numbers from higher ups. I'm going to quote here, quote, we were always playing shell games to not make clear to our leadership how many troops we had there, end quote. That was in an interview with Jeffrey talking about the actual number of troops in northeast Syria, which he was saying he told Trump, other people had told Trump, was roughly 200 troops that Trump had initially agreed to leave there in 2019. Several times more than that, somewhere like around the 800, 900 region, somewhere in that vicinity, many more, a factor of a couple times more than what they were saying. In any event, also, just brief note on this, the Washington Post Beirut bureau chief, when she was covering this, actually laughed about this on Twitter, sort of joking about this. Again, it's against Trump, certainly, so she's laughing, oh, they were lying to Trump, but Trump's incompetent, he doesn't have the actual numbers here. But again, she's joking about the administration in a war, lowered down, lying to the higher ups in order to keep the war going, in order to keep our intervention going. Just ugly stuff. In any event, we've only got a couple of minutes left, Scott. I wanted to ask you, do you think, and when do you think Trump would, or when do you think he should concede the election if he doesn't have enough institutional momentum, if the facts aren't there, first and foremost, if there wasn't actually sufficient voter fraud to swing the election in favor of Biden against Trump, if that's not what's happened, if it was a legitimate election in that sense, when do you think he should concede?
Well, he should concede as a matter of, constitutional law, meaning that when the Electoral College, these recounts, these challenges, everything need to be done by December 8th, which I think is the safe harbor date for the Electoral College. And then I think on the 14th, somewhere around there, they will actually cast their votes. At that point in time, when it becomes clear that Joe Biden has 270 plus constitutionally viable electoral votes, it's over. And at that point in time, Donald Trump must do what is constitutionally required of him, which is, concede the election, however gracefully or graciously he wants to be about that is his business. But he also needs at that point in time to ensure that the President-elect Biden, incoming administration gets the full support for the transition that is constitutionally and lawfully required. All this noise about, he's holding up the transition, that's garbage. Biden doesn't need to begin doing the transition until he has a constitutional mandate. In the past, there's been some courtesy for, allowing phase 2, transition funds to be released and authorizations to be released by the GSA and all that. But no, that is not required until the Electoral College has certified a winner, and everybody knows this, and so that's when Trump will do it if required. And from his point of view, a miracle occurs, and he flips some states, Supreme Court intervenes, whatever, and he gets the votes, then he's the next president. They're going to have 4 more years, but right now it looks like Biden's going to prevail, and he just has to be patient, let constitutional due process play itself out. And that's what we're seeing here. It's not a coup. It's not Trump, doing anything other than what he is permitted by law to challenge a contested election by law. And so let's get it done. Let's let this play out. And then, once we get clarity, Trump will move forward. There's no doubt in my mind that if the Electoral College certifies Joe Biden as the president-elect, then Donald Trump will do what is required of him constitutionally.
Only a couple of weeks out here. Scott, we are out of time. We will see how this comes to pass, and we'll get you on soon to talk about it. For those listening, Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower, and you can follow him on Twitter at Real Scott Ritter. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time for our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news and events across those divided states as well as across our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together on that wall, you should know that you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And getting directly into the news this morning, in the headlines, after the final states were called on Friday, with Georgia going to Biden and North Carolina going to Trump, Trump tweeted early Sunday, that's early yesterday, that he, quote, concedes nothing, end quote, before tweeting late Sunday night that the Constitution had been, quote, shattered and violated, end quote, by the election, and that he had, quote, won the election, end quote. Just talking about Scott Ritter with this, when Trump would, when he should concede. He was putting a hard date there, December 8th. That is the natural date. That's when the Electoral College needs to have everything submitted, basically. That's when everything is effectively done. He's predicting Trump will concede at that point. Didn't have time to talk about it towards the end of that last segment, but Jamarl, I wanted to get your take. Do you think he's right? Do you think that at that point Trump would, if the Electoral College, if they recognize Biden as the official winner, do you think Trump's going to back down, or what do you think?
I got to be honest, I don't know. I look at this from a standpoint of what are the incentives and the drives that motivate the person's decision and opinion, and for that matter, even their ideological moorings. It seems that when you bet a lot on this notion that I was cheated, I was rigged, I'm Trump, I will always win this thing, etc., then you've set kind of a groundwork where you can never concede. It's too big. You would have to basically repudiate everything that you've said over the past X amount of time. And for all of those millions of people that have backed you up saying it's been rigged, it's cheated, and everything else, for you to come out and say, okay, it wasn't. It's a difficult thing to do, just from the standpoint of where you started. So I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with Scott. I don't think Trump is going to concede at all, even if he may give these kind of tactic, okay, I'm going to leave, but I'm not saying that I lost. It may be something like that, where the person leaves, the person doesn't create any kind of hysteria on their way out, but they refuse to concede all the way through saying I was cheated, which is almost honestly just as damaging, or maybe the most damaging position that a president can take, short of basically trying to take the election. Because at that point, you leave 20 million people saying this was cheated. So I don't think he's going to concede. I think he's just going to leave.
Yeah, well, I mean that's an effective concession. You get, I get what you're saying though. He won't speak the words, but he will act the act, because that's what he practically needs to do, unless he wants to get literally escorted out, which would be embarrassing. It's never getting fired in that way, where you're having to carry your banker's box outside. That's never a fun thing to do, and it's certainly not a good look. And Trump.
The president escorted out by Secret Service
on how he looks.
Yeah.
No,
that would be horrendous. Also, it occurred to me that it's possible that Donald Trump is looking for a business opportunity immediately after leaving the White House. And conceding might not be the best way in getting that opportunity, especially if you want to keep X amount of millions of people on the hook. I just don't know. Honestly, I mean, look, I don't know the inner workings of Trump. I can only go by the optics. And from the optics, it seems like a self-centered, extraordinarily egotistical man that, based on following and everything else, he may have a hard time doing it. So it's very possible that he just leaves without the concession, which, again, this doesn't typically happen in the United States, but it may this time around. That's my
there's
guess.
Another interesting. I hear you. There's another. So there are definitely reason to slight somebody for being egotistical. Frankly, it's probably not good for them psychologically. I mean, that's the silly starting point possibly when you're looking at the president, considering how they feel, how they think. But, if you fixate too much on your ego, then you're probably living a tormented life in some sense. But then, of course, there's also this take if you have a president who's egotistical, self-centered, they're going to be short-sighted. They're going to be myopic in a sort of existential sense. They're going to be considering their interest first and foremost above the interest of the state. Here's the other thing, though. As far as I can tell, the only way you would get a non-egotistical and non-self-centered leader to get into office is if you have some momentum, some institutional momentum, either from the establishment or from some institution that's built up in opposition to the establishment. And right now, there is nothing coherent like that. There's nothing even on the horizon as far as I can tell. In other words, you got the establishment. So Biden, here's the thing, as far as I can tell from what I've heard, other than the awkward and potentially perverted, like caressing of people's heads and hair and the weird comments and asides, all that stuff. From what I've heard, he's supposed to be a sweet person on a personal level. Sure, bombed millions, been responsible for that, incarcerated many. Sure, the things that he's done supposed to be bad, but he doesn't seem like a particularly self-centered guy in the classical sense, but particularly when you compare him to Trump. But maybe he's been put into the presidency because the establishment wants him to be president. That's what's capable of making him president. In other words, here's where I'm going with this. If you want an effective reform of American politics, and there's an assumption here that maybe that effective reform is going to be driven by somebody who's not egotistical or not self-centered, who can put the interests of the nation above their own interests, then you need some long-lasting institution, something that's durable, sustainable, and potent to elevate them into that office, to get them through the primaries and to push them into the seat of the president in the Oval Office. Here's where I'm going with this. Real quick, Jamarl, do you think Trump is going to leave behind any political weight? Do you think there's going to be any new right wing or alternative dissident wing or anything like that outside of the RNC, independent of traditional RNC policies after Trump, or is this just going to be a flash in the pan? What's your take?
Like if there's going to be like another party or another organization, like third way Democrats versus like the New Deal, Democrat, that type of stuff.
Yeah, even a coherent ideology. Or even a coherent ideology that like has its own sort of magazines and online outlets and is determining itself in some sense. Right? You see what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
I could see Trump sitting at the head of a media organization.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes.
What does that look like to you? What does that look like to you right now?
That's the catch. I mean, it depends. Like, what do you think the difference between Donald Trump and the Republican Party is? Because they do hate his guts. So what's the difference between, let's say, like the RNC and a Trump?
I think Trump is way less oriented on traditional political appearances. He's a lot more brash. That's the sort of rhetorical, superficial end of it. And I think on the policy end, he's way more economically and militarily isolationist than the Republicans have traditionally been. So the Republicans, party of, along with the Democrats, admittedly, party of free trade, party of privatization, party of not just sort of, nationally and internationally, more market-oriented approaches to things. And then militarily, neocons have traditionally, as far as I can tell, come out of, by and large, the Republicans. Sure, many Democrats too, but by and large, plenty of military interventionism, plenty of, chauvinism there. If I had to put it.
Yeah, Trump seems more skeptical. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I think the answer is yes. I don't see how it can't. I mean, Donald Trump, think of the number of votes Trump got. If Democratic vote turnout was flat, meaning if Democrats had to go to the polls, they'd probably lose this. I mean, if you look at the number of votes that Donald Trump got, he increased his vote totals. He increased his share of votes by minorities, by blacks, by Hispanics. He was whatever you think of him, whatever you think of how bad he is and everything else, he clearly was able to get votes. And he clearly has a huge number of people who back him and like him. So I would be shocked if it just died in a pan. I think
a lot of people are curious.
No, I was just saying, I think you're right. I think there's going to be things that extend beyond Trump after the election.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I like the fact that Trump appears to have been the start of this. That Trump is going to be at least a figurehead that was put at the start of that movement. Because I'm not personally that much of a fan of Trump, but broadly, I agree with a lot of it. I agree that we should do less of the economic intervention. The military interventionism stuff. And even economically, I can see definitely a strong case to be made that we should return to manufacturing, for instance, return to R&D in the United States, high-tech manufacturing, get more factories back into the hands of Americans, generally policies of economic uplift instead of sort of overextending ourselves to support this empire that we built for ourselves. Anyway, another conversation there. We've got to go through headlines here. Just quick note. I don't like that Trump is the figurehead dude for that, but hey, you get what you can, I guess. Not that I agree with whatever is going to come in his wake. necessarily. Anyway, back into the headlines here. Officials in the United States have reported more than 11 million total cases of coronavirus as of Sunday, as cases passed 10 million just a week ago, and more than 1 in 400 Americans have tested positive since. At least 623 new coronavirus deaths and 135,187 new cases were reported in the United States on November 15th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 150,265 cases per day. That's an increase of 81% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of Monday morning, that's this morning, more than 11,112,800 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 246,000 have died. The real big headline here, though, in my opinion, 1 million total cases reported in a week. And again, 1 million total cases reported in a week. I believe the last record there was 1 million total cases in 10 days. So the exponential curve is exponentiating. You have the hockey stick going into cold and flu season, which lasted, by my accounts, what is it, another 3 months, something like that. So I don't know if there's an end in sight. People will talk about herd immunity in some sense. Only time will tell. Of course, the real worry here is death rate, is the deaths going up as this spreads throughout society. In any event, moving to international news, on Sunday, Peru's interim president Manuel Merino stepped down only 5 days after he assumed the post. Merino was the president of Congress until being appointed interim president of Peru after Congress impeached former President Martin Vizcarra over corruption allegations on Monday. Vizcarra has denied the allegations. Vizcarra's impeachment sparked protests across the country starting Monday that continued for 6 nights in a row, leaving at least 2 people dead and 94 injured as of Saturday night. A little bit further, really on the other side of the globe, the RCEP has been signed. Sunday morning, 15 nations have signed on to the largest trade deal in the world. Signatories include 30% of the world's population and GDP and reach 2.2 billion consumers. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that's the RCEP again, is made up of 10 Southeast Asian countries, as well as South Korea, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. China here is really the key organizer of this. They're the one pushing for this. And the deal excludes the U.S., which withdrew from a rival Asia-Pacific trade pact in 2017 under Trump. That is the TPP. That would have been one of Obama's major diplomatic coups, had it been stuck to by the United States. And Obama, we were talking about this with Bradley Blankenship last Friday. Obama saw China, obviously, as a rising economic powerhouse, but also a rising diplomatic powerhouse. And he was very concerned that if he didn't get the TPP or something like it through, that China would get this thing passed. And as it is, it appears that they have. The deal still needs to be ratified. That'll take a couple of years for all the countries to fully go through and agree to the details here, work out some of those kinks. But it appears to be going through. This is years in the making. And again, now the largest trade pact in the world. In Ethiopia, several rockets have been fired from the Tigray region, hitting near the airport in Eritrea's capital city of Asmara. The rockets were fired from Ethiopia's Tigray region. Again, that's according to 5 diplomats, as the conflict between government forces and a separatist group spilled beyond Ethiopia's borders. At least 2 of the rockets hit the Asmara airport on Saturday evening. 3 of the diplomats said, However, the United States Embassy contradicted those reports, saying there were, quote, no indications the airport was struck, end quote. Nevertheless, it did confirm reports of a, quote, series of loud noises, end quote, in the vicinity, and it told U.S. citizens in Eritrea to remain in their homes on Sunday. This move threatens to precipitate a wider conflict in the Horn of Africa and what has hitherto been a conflict restricted to Ethiopia's borders, as President Abiy Ahmed contests for political control with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Last headline this morning, SpaceX launched 4 astronauts to the International Space Station, that's the ISS, on Sunday, last night, on the first full-fledged taxi flight for NASA by a private company. The Dragon capsule on top, that's named Resilience by its crew in light of this year's many challenges, most notably COVID-19, reached orbit 9 minutes later. It is due to reach the space station late Monday and remain there until spring. Commander Mike Hopkins said right before liftoff that, quote, by working together through these difficult times, you've inspired the nation, the world, and in no small part, the name of this incredible vehicle, Resilience, end quote. Once reaching orbit, he radioed, quote, that was one heck of a ride, end quote. Sidelined by the coronavirus himself, SpaceX founder and chief executive Elon Musk was forced to monitor the action from afar. He tweeted that he, quote, most likely, end quote, had a moderate case of COVID-19. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break, and we will be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and definitely share the audio or the video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We'll be taking calls at 9:45, as always. But joining us currently is Jen Derenwater, founder and executive director of Crushing Colonialism, an international indigenous multimedia collective. She is fellow at Disability Futures, a former fellow at the New Economics Reporting Project, and the co-creator and co-host of the Decolonialized News Hour on Real News Network. You can follow Jen on Twitter at Jen Derenwater and on Decolonialized News Hour on the Real News Network. Jen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
No, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. This is a really interesting topic for me because I'm always fascinated. I'm always confused is the wrong word for it. More so not knowing an answer or not knowing how to mend certain issues that come from our complicated histories. And we can focus on the United States for a moment. We have a complicated history in this country, to put it mildly, especially from the standpoint of the way that races interact, the way that the government itself has interacted with those races, either putting laws in the book for slavery or Jim Crow, all of those things. And at some point, especially after the protests and the BLM movement, and there was this kind of conversation that seemed to take place in the country on how to mend the gap. How do we finally put this stuff to rest? How do you deal with the centuries of racial inequality and the advantages that certain segments of the population got off of other segments of the population? And so I'm so glad you're here. So let's start there. From the standpoint of this complicated history that we have in this country, how does one go, a government, if it legitimately wanted to put these things to bed and put these things to rest? They don't have a time machine, so you can only move forward. How do you move forward in mending these gaps?
Well, I mean, like you said, there is no time machine. There's no undoing what has been done. However, there are certainly things that could be done to work towards rectifying the situation and bringing justice for Indigenous people. And one of those things is tribal sovereignty. And when I say tribal sovereignty, what that means is that we as sovereign nations determine what happens on our lands. Something a lot of non-Native folks don't realize is that Indigenous people were not necessarily a race of people. We are members of sovereign nations. And that's something a little different than being a race. Like, we have been racialized under, colonialism and white supremacy. But, if you ask me, I'm going to say I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. That's going to be my response. I'm not going to say I'm Native American, because I'm Cherokee Nation. That's my tribe. That's my people. We have our own governments, our own languages, our own court systems. We have a lot of our own ways. And the first thing we need is tribal sovereignty. We need the United States to basically get its foot off our necks so that we can survive. A lot of the issues that we're living under now, the extreme poverty and houselessness and food insecurity, a lot of these issues, these were purposely created by the white man. And we have to also remember that the United States is not the first colonizer that's been on this land. We have over 500 years of genocide, and it came from multiple colonizing nations. My people, for example, we had the Spanish, the French, the British, and then the U.S. So that also creates a legacy of problems. Treaties that different tribal nations signed with whichever king they were under. The United States was supposed to take those treaties on, but they didn't. And then with the treaties they signed with us, we know that they haven't honored a single one of them. And tribal sovereignty is one of those things that we're supposed to have, which means we determine what happens on our lands. But we don't have that right.
Jen, again, thank you for being with us. This is Shane here. I'm curious. I just want to get into specifics first. There's some larger issues I'd like to talk about, but thankfully we have the time for that. When you say tribal sovereignty, what specifically are you talking about? And I guess another way to ask this question is, in what ways are the rights of reservations and of Native American communities in those reservations, how are those being infringed upon? What rights are not being granted to them that through tribal sovereignty would be granted or would be held as simply native and simply inherent? Anyway, Jen, what's your take?
Well, there's a whole host of things. So I'll give you a few examples of more recent happenings. For example, up in so-called Canada, there's the Mi'kmaq people. They have a sovereign right to fishing, and the white locals just lost their minds basically and started attacking the Mi'kmaq fishermen. They set some of their buildings on fire, all because they were angry that the Mi'kmaq had been given a few fishing licenses. And we've seen that here in the U.S. over the years. We can have lands that are not necessarily a reservation, but they're trust and treaty lands, and that can mean a host of different things depending on the tribe and the treaty. But it often will mean things like hunting rights and fishing rights. But we've seen it time and time again that white people, whenever we try to exercise our legal rights, they just I don't even know how to explain it. Just the violence comes out so horribly. You can see this with pipelines and other resource extraction projects that are on our trust and treaty lands. We don't consent to those things a lot of times, yet our voices are not heard and pipelines and things still get built. Right now with COVID-19, the Native community has been one of the hardest hit communities in this country. And when our tribal leaders have tried to put protective measures in place, like we'll take, for example, in South Dakota, the Cheyenne River Sioux, the Rosebud, and I believe Pine Ridge Reservation all put checkpoints on the roads that go through their lands. They weren't stopping anyone from traveling through, but they were doing checkpoints so that they could do their own contact tracing and try to limit the amount of people coming onto their reservations. And the Cheyenne River Sioux ended up having to sue President Trump and the South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem because they were trying to stop the road checkpoints. There's just so many examples of this. The U.S. government also keeps our hands tied on commerce and on our ability to tax. Like, we're not allowed to tax non-natives that come onto our lands. And then when your own people are living in dire poverty, as not always the case, but is as often the case, your people can't pay taxes. So how do you fund your government? Well, tribal governments end up having to be funded pretty heavily by the United States government. And as we can see time and time again throughout history, colonized people cannot rely on their colonizer to keep them healthy and alive. And also, we don't want to rely on the white man. That's not what we want. We want our ways back. We want our land back. But this is the situation we've been put in. We see things like this as well around acts of violence on our land. There's a Supreme Court case, Oliphant via the Suquamish tribe, and it happened in the 70s. It was a white man who went onto tribal land, assaulted a tribal officer, and the tribe arrested him and was going to try him. Well, he said, well, I'm not Native. I shouldn't be subject to your laws. This eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, no, tribes don't have the right to convict people who come on our land and commit crimes. So that's one of the reasons we have such devastatingly high rates of violence against our women and children. On some reservations, Native women are killed at 10 times the average rate in this country. The DOJ put out a study a few years back that found that 0.3% of Native women have been assaulted in our lifetimes. And frankly, I think that number is higher. And it's a large part, in fact, is because of the United States government and all the ways that they keep us down. And you can see this across other lands where Indigenous people are, like in Canada, Colombia, and so forth. There's always some colonizer coming around, making it hard for us to survive.
What would it mean for you guys to have your land back and have all the rights to it? I mean, you just named one in the sense of legalities. And also, just in a more basic way, the treaties that are signed, meaning because there have been treaties, even by the United States, that were signed against many of the indigenous communities. Those treaties themselves have no value from a legal standpoint, meaning there's no way to challenge legalities associated, or let's say extensions from those treaties in courts of law. It's basically, the treaty is just fluff at that point. It has no value.
Well, I don't know that I would phrase it like that. For many Native people, our treaties are sacred. We took part in ceremonies when we signed them, and we take them seriously. So I would not call them fluff. However, the United States government has broken every single treaty. And every time we have to take legal action, we're not going through our court systems. We're going through the United States court systems. And law students don't have to learn treaty law. They don't have to know anything about it. You don't have to know treaty law to pass the bar. You don't have to know treaty law to be a judge. So even if you get a sympathetic judge in front of you, if they don't know anything about the treaties and they don't know anything about Native people, then they're not going to rule in your favor generally. And that's a lot of what happens. We are constantly in the courts suing the government, suing pipeline companies, suing this, suing that, and we don't often win. And it's because we're having to go through our colonizer system for this. So, there are legal actions that can be taken. It's just that the system is rigged against us, so we don't often win. And then in terms of getting our land back, along with just some of the things I've already stated, it's also cultural. It's a tie to our ancestors. It's our religious freedom as well. Because for us, it's not the same as going to a church or synagogue or mosque. Our religious beliefs, our spiritual beliefs are tied to our lands. And when you take those lands from us, we can't practice our religions. We can't practice our spirituality. It wasn't even until 1990 that we fully had our legal rights to different traditional medicines that the white men came in and outlawed. And now we're seeing through capitalism, some of our traditional medicines, like sage, for example, are now being commercialized and sold by predominantly white people. And so now Native people are having a hard time getting sage. It's a whole host of things. And, my ancestral lands, for example, are not in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is where my people were forced to under the Indian Removal Act. but our ancestral lands are across the Southeast. But we have, with the exception of one very teeny tiny pocket of North Carolina, we have no sovereignty over those lands. We have no say over what happens on those lands. And an example of one of the, egregious parts of this is that, when pipeline companies, for example, I do a lot of coverage on environmental justice issues. So that's why I keep going back to pipeline.
Let's do this. Let's take a quick break, and we're going to bring you back, and we're going to let you finish that conversation. But just to make one point, my grandfather was Cherokee. I think he was like 1/2 or 1/4 Cherokee. And those elements of our life, for the most part, weren't visible to us. We knew nothing about it. It wasn't necessarily talked about. It was something we just understood. Because at that point, he's my grandfather. But this stuff has almost been like wiped away in many respects. And I think part of that has to do a lot with, like you said, many of the lands being just taken. This is Jen Derenwater, founder and executive director of Crushing Colonialism, an international indigenous multimedia collective. She is fellow at Disability Futures, a former fellow at the New Economies Reporting Project, and co-creator and co-host of the Decolonialized News Hour on the Real News Network. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Jen Derenwater. She is the founder and executive director of Crushing Colonialism, an international indigenous multimedia collective. She is a fellow at Disability Futures, a former fellow at the New Economies Reporting Project, and the co-creator and co-host of the Decolonized News Hour on the Real News Network. You can follow Jen, by the way, on Twitter at Jen Derenwater and on the Decolonized News Hour on the Real News Network. Jen, thank you again for being with us. As we were going into the break, you were talking about your interest in economic justice, and that's why you focus on pipelines. We had to go into a break, but I just wanted to let you pick that back up. What were you saying there?
So one of the things I was going to say is just giving another example as to having our land back and why it's important, is the act of repatriation. So repatriation is the bringing home of our ancestors and their remains. We've been pillaged by universities and museums and so forth for so long, people taking our ancestors' remains and keeping them for themselves or for their institutions. And so we see these repatriation problems when we don't have sovereignty over our lands. And so as I was saying, my people's lands, the Cherokee, are throughout the Southeast. Most of us are now in Oklahoma because of the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, but our ancestral lands are across the Southeast. And so one of the issues we have, because we don't have sovereignty over the vast majority of these lands, is like, for example, there's a really big push to frack the Marcellus and Utica shales for gas. And so there's all kinds of pipeline and gas-related infrastructure projects going up across central Appalachia, some of this falling on my people's ancestral lands. And so when these projects, when they come in and start digging and doing construction, they're finding remains of people. Some of those remains could be my ancestors. but we don't have a right to consultation on what's happening on these lands. We don't have the right to repatriate our ancestors if they are dug up. You know, there's in those instances, it becomes the landowner's property. So non-native people, almost entirely white people, end up owning our ancestral remains because we don't have sovereignty on those lands. So land back and tribal sovereignty is vast in the ways that it impacts us as Indigenous people.
I'm curious, what is it like on the reservations from the standpoint of the politics, the way of life? And you kind of made the point once before that it doesn't seem like the tribes have entire sovereignty even over the reservations in the way that it could stop people from coming in or going out, meaning non-tribesmen. Can you give us an idea of what it's like on those reservations politically, economically, and for the most part, socially?
Well, it varies greatly. I mean, that's the thing. If you ask one native what life is like for them in their tribe and on their lands, and you ask another native, you can get two completely different answers, you know, because once again, we're a vast people. You know, we have over 500 federally recognized tribes in the U.S., and that's not including the tribal nations that the government refuses to recognize. So life is different in every place. Some reservations are more urban, some are incredibly rural. You know, some tribal nations have more money. You know, my tribe, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, we're the largest federally recognized tribe in the country, and we have a lot more money and power than, say, you know, some of the smaller tribes that maybe have 5,000 members. So life for us is going to be different than life for another tribe. But something I really want to point out, because there's always this focus on the reservations, and while I think that is really important, we also have to remember that 71% of Native people live in urban areas. So most of us are living in cities or in suburbs. We're not living on reservations. And so then when we get to these cities, we have even less rights as a people. And we were also purposefully relocated to urban areas during what we refer to as the 1950s termination era. And this was another way that the United States government tried to break up our tribal nations, tried to get around our trust and treaty right to tribal sovereignty, and basically to also break us down as a community and a culture. You know, it's one more way of erasing us. You know, we see this with acts of genocide. When you can't literally kill all the people, you go after their culture and their way of life and try to assimilate them out into, you know, whatever way of life your colonizer, your abuser wants.
Jen, broadly, so much to talk about here. I want to get you back on to keep having this conversation. If you look at North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, just sort of sticking to that hemisphere, are there any countries that stand out for having done a better job on this issue, on the issue of dealing with Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples, Jen?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm certainly not an expert on what happens outside of the U.S. I would say I'm even not necessarily an expert within the U.S. because, you know, there's over 500 years of history and treaties in different tribal nations. But from everything that I know, no, every colonizing nation is awful to Indigenous people. So I also hesitate to say, well, this place is better than this one, because frankly, I'm not interested in a kinder, more gentle version of colonization. You know, there is no kinder, gentle colonization. It's all colonization. It's all violence. It's all brutality at the end of the day. I think Canada sometimes gets this reputation of being, so liberal and so much better to their people and such, but they're awful to the Native people and the nations up there. They're horrendous to them. So really, I don't think there is anywhere where Indigenous people are really being treated the way we should be treated.
Well, just to follow up here, what complicates things? I was just looking into, you're talking about the Micmac and fishing rights. 72% of Canadians say that Micmac fishing rights should be respected. It seems like the government is by and large the main entity opposing the extension of those rights. Granted, they did it, but it's even then, it seems like there's a minority of opposition here. It seems like by and large, the public, at least up in Canada, on that one sort of more marginal issue, is in favor of it. Which, that's heartening. I mean, you're talking about, again, so many kinds of so many aspects of this conversation we could be having. I'm out in Sioux Falls right now, lived here on and off a couple of different times in South Dakota. The reservations and there's a deep problem. One of the main problems that the government has had with the reservations, frankly, is taking kids away from their families on the reservations, putting them with non-reservation parents through foster care programs. And this cycle of abuse where basically parents outside of the reservations are paid money by the government, paid subsidies basically to take native kids. This sort of fits. When I was 17, I was working up on a farm in British Columbia that had a long history of working with local Native Americans. And they were saying, basically, they were teaching me, there's this long history of re-education programs where you're constantly taking away the future by taking away the past of Native families. It seems like this broad spectrum issue. So on a lot of this stuff, we really deeply agree. I guess here's where some of the real interesting stuff comes to. You're talking about repatriation. You're talking about specifically land management and restoring lands that are currently owned in part either by companies or by individual homeowners, in some cases by the American government, by the federal government. What does that look like for you? That's where it could get contentious. That's where we could start to disagree. How do you see that process going? And that's part of why I was asking if there are any countries that have handled this better. In other words, are there any models of behavior that you see worthy of emulating, at least in part? But Jen, what's your take? How do you see that possibly going?
Well, I don't think there's any country doing that right. And to the point about the Mi'kmaq, like, sure, most Canadians supported their right to their fishing licenses, but when it comes down to actual tribal sovereignty and land back, people don't support that. Just because you support one issue doesn't mean you're going to support another. And the minute Native people talk about tribal sovereignty or land back, non-Native people, overwhelmingly white people, lose their minds. Well, you're not taking my land, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, actually, you stole our land and you're squatting on our land. So frankly, I don't really feel a lot of empathy for you. But these lands need to be restored to Native people. They were stolen from us. And even in the situations where we did negotiate treaties, those are not being honored. And oftentimes those treaties were sometimes negotiated because we were kind of at a point where we didn't have a choice. But, to the point of cultural survival, this is some of the issues we're talking about in the event series I'm doing this week called the 3 R's, Realize, Recognize, and Reconciliation. Today is a Native 101, just kind of a come learn about Native people. But tomorrow, our topic is speaking about the theft of Indigenous children. And, we're going to be talking about the boarding and residential schools where our children were forcefully taken from our people and forced into these horrendous schools where they were just brutalized and abused and oftentimes ended up dying. So we'll talk about that. And then, there's things like Child Protective Services, like you mentioned. They'll come in and take Native children away from our communities for things as ridiculous as you're too poor to raise a child. But then they'll turn around and give them to white Christian homes and give those people money to raise our children. We see this separation from our people in a variety of ways. We're seeing it with ICE detention. A lot of those children that have been taken and separated from their families, those are Indigenous children. So this is an ongoing problem. But in terms of the land back, I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers. And I don't think any one person could nor should pretend to have all the answers. But the land needs to come back under our control. And I mean, that's just the end of it. Until we have our lands back, until we have the right to rule and govern over those lands, we are going to continue to suffer a genocide. And when we natives talk about land back, we're not saying that we're going to kick everybody off the land. That's not what we're saying. A lot of us are mixed race. I am mixed race. We're not telling our family members, that's it, leave, you're not welcome here. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that these are our lands and we have the right to rule over them as we need and as we see fit.
And to be clear, from my end, I'm not a hardliner on this one. For instance, you were talking about ecological, specifically, I forget exactly what the term was. I think environmental justice. I'm in favor of ecological restoration projects on a large scale. At one point, the Great Bison Belt through much of North America basically carried America's vast grassland ecosystems, prairies, forests, et cetera. And then in the last 400, 500 years, through European colonization, we wiped that out. And I think one resolution of that problem, one way to restore that vast ecosystem would be potentially dramatically increasing the land held by Native Americans. And then ideally, in the long run, you engage in ecological restoration projects that bring that back. And specifically, you're talking about, like we were talking about with children being taken away from their families. Often what happens, and I saw this in South Dakota, is those kids get abused. Those kids get moved into foster programs. They get put with largely white parents. Those white parents get money to raise the kids, and then they will abuse them. They'll sexually abuse them. They'll deny them what they need. It basically becomes a money-making scheme for the parents, and it gets overlooked by state authorities, where in South Dakota, specifically the Attorney General, I was investigating a case a number of years ago where the Attorney General overlooked a cyclical sexual abuse by this family, this one family in particular, where the authorities knew that it was going on, but they got money when the state got money when they administered this program, and the family got money when they were taking the kids in. And so both of the sort of relevant parties here kept it hush hush. And it's just this ugly, ugly scene in any event. Jen, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'd be glad to have you back on soon. Again, where can people find the 3 R's program that you're talking about?
So if they go to our website, crushingcolonialism.org, and you click on the calendar, you'll see all 5 days events. We have 5 different events, all covering a different important topic related to Indigenous rights and justice. The events are from 6 to 7:30 Eastern time, and people can buy tickets and register up to 2 hours before each day's event.
And that is on crushingcolonialism.org. Again, thank you, Jen, for joining us.
All right. Thank you for having me on.
For those listening, Jen Deerenwater is the founder and executive director of Crushing Colonialism, an international Indigenous multimedia collective. Check her out on Twitter at Jen Deerenwater, and check her out on the Decolonized News Hour on the Real News Network. And last but not least, check out crushingcolonialism.org for information on those events. You're listening to Fault Lines. We're taking calls on the other side of this break. 202-521-1320 is the number. Call in then. Back in just a minute. Fault Lines.
Fault Lines.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we are taking your calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our phone lines are open, and the phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, how are you doing this morning, and what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I was reading an article from Ray McGarvin. He wrote for Custodian News, and I shared the link to y'all tweet for today about Brennan being nervous as Trump declassified the Russiagate documents. And it goes in detail how he breaks it down, why, Brennan is so nervous about it. Because you remember Brennan testified, he did all that. So if these documents come out with Russiagate, then Brennan can get caught, in a perjury. I mean, he can get sentenced for perjury and, basically lying. And Ray McGarvin did a good job. So Trump have to for the 28th time I'm saying this, but he have to declassify that. He have to declassify the document, and that would also lead to lawsuits to the media and maybe other organizations, and it probably stop some of these illegal programs going on in the United States and throughout the world, and bring our troops home and invest in ourselves, infrastructure and things like that, instead of giving the CIA $30 billion a year and the other black budgets. That money can go here to get, any homeless and also help people out with mental problems and all that. So that's what I wanted to say. But yeah, it's a good article by Ray McGovern. I think y'all should have him on, Whitney Webb, and also Bill Benny and Kurt Whitby. Those four on would be tremendous. That's my opinion. That's my advice. That's all.
Tarif, stand for a second. I got two questions. Thank you for the call. One, where can people find that article again?
Oh, okay. Look, check this out. Okay, everybody's listening. You can go to Consortium News, or you can go to Ray McGovern tweet. Okay, or you can go to the tweet for today underneath Fort Lines Radio, right? And I have it up where y'all can take a look at that over and y'all can read. It's a long write-up, and it breaks down the names of the people that was actually stopping it. And Trump replaced them with good people like General Miller and other people that's going to basically, hopefully one day, release the documents. So
okay, thank you for that, Tarif. And then second question.
Just to be clear, wait. Just to be clear, that's consortium news.
Yes, consortium, yeah.
And then Tarif, while we have you on, I've kind of been meaning to do this for a little while, assuming you're still there. I just wanted to ask you, you've been calling in for a long time now, for I believe over a year, for many months. You will kind of consistently, occasionally bring up your whistleblowing case where you're working with the Veterans Administration, with the VA. And you basically, this is what I know. I've looked into it a little bit, but I don't know too much about it. I wanted to hear more from you about what you were doing, what you saw, when this happened, just sort of the facts of the story. What I know of it is you saw that in a VA administration building, there was dirty water. They were overlooking the water. You tried to blow the whistle on this, and you got covered up. Can you tell us what were the details on that? What happened, Tarif?
Well, no, I didn't at the time when I was working there. Even when I was working there through the work program in 2010 through the regional office, I saw it. But you know how you see nobody else saying, when anybody else ain't saying nothing about it, you think, okay, is this normal? Or is it just me? Because it was eating me up. So I didn't think to blow the whistle when I was working there, because you had people working there with PhDs that was head of the VA and underneath. People were like, chemical engineers, and you had the JCO used to come there to certify the hospitals. They go around to the hospital and certify to make sure everything's clean, everything's neat. So it's passing the JCO test, it was passing all these tests. Who was me to say anything about it? But I was bringing it up with my coworkers. I didn't bring up my supervisors because I didn't think at the time. You didn't know how you ask your friends. You try to get a guesstimation to whether to try to figure out to do something or not, or because wasn't for sure. I mean, I know I saw it. I saw the pipe, the 20-inch pipe that was packed with mud. It was packed. It splashed on my shirt, and I was like, I asked my coworker, I said, man, please tell me, they got a filter for this? He said, no. If the ice machines and the water fountains, if they don't have ice machines the filters for the single ice machines, because we had over 60 ice machines and water fountains, right? If they don't have filters, then they get straight dirty water. This dirty water is going straight to the toilets, the sinks, the showers, the kitchen, and whatnot. Now, I got to admit, the people that sterilize the tools, like the surgery tools, in the dentistry, they had their own filter systems. All right, but everything else
it was going into the drink. It was going into the drinking water through the ice machines. But what you're saying is that medically, they had another source of water, so it's not necessarily contaminating that. This is 2010. You said it's in the regional building. Is this in Louisiana? Is that the regional building? No. Where is it?
Michael E. DeBake is located in in Southport, in the Southport of Houston. It's the second largest federal building in the United States. It's part of the medical center. It's connected to the other medical centers, like MD Anderson, all the rest of them. And they treat veterans at their hospital. And people come to the hospital to learn. Now, what I was saying is this: the water coming from the 20-inch pipe from the city is going straight to the building 100. You know, big old building. They didn't have a main filter for the building to filter that water. So what I'm trying to say is this: when we had problems when the building would stop receiving water, the mud would have built up in the pipe so much it would have stopped the flow of the water going to the building. So when the co-workers would unloosen the valve to shake it loose, that mud that built up would go throughout the building. And we had other work orders would come to us talking about, hey, we got the tallest foot up with mud. We got mud coming out the sinks, coming out the faucet where you brush your teeth, wash your hand at, the shower heads, where patients take baths at. So the nurses, the nurses had to let the shower heads run, let the water run, so the water go back very clear again. You see what I'm saying? And the water was so dirty that even if they had filters on the ice machines, the filters was scheduled for so many thousands of hours, like 3 to 6 months. It wouldn't even last that long, man, because the water was so dirty it would just override the filter. We went to a 2-filter system per ice machine, water fountain machine, right? That was called Felix. I think it was Felix machines. It was very expensive, like $4,000 a pop. But anyway, so we went to a 2-filter system. Even a 2-filter system was having a hard time because sometimes we go change the filters. One side that was coming from, that's the untreated side, you would be dark, like a dark brownish color. That's how dirty the water was. And the other side would be like a light brownish color coming, of the other side of the filter. I don't know if I'm trying to explain this the best way I could. That means that filter was no good anymore, which means you had dirt contamination that's in the ice that they give to the patient.
Tariq, quick question. We only have a few minutes, but was there any way to keep the water from being dirty before hitting the filter?
Yes, if they would have installed a main filter for the whole hospital, like at the it was at the pump house. Okay, I'm trying to tell y'all how this works. You got pressure coming from the city, right? The water comes from the city. It goes to our pipe, and our pipe brings it to the pump house. The pump house got these big old pumps that push the water to building 100, which is the main building, right? Then they got other pumps that push the water up the risers of the building. Now, somewhere in those lines, they could have installed a main system. They could have knocked out that dirt.
Like now, at the pump house, for instance, just to take that as an example.
They could have done that right down. But what I found out by doing my own research, I got a FOIA request from Houston. Now I got on when I looked into this in 2016 when I got a FOIA request from Houston. I found out it actually probably begun in 2005.
Oh, so it's been going on for over a decade at that point. When you saw it, it was about 5 years. Tarif, we're going into our last minute. We've got to cut this off. But when you call back in at some other point, maybe not this next time, but sometime soon, I'd love to get further into this story. It's an interesting conversation. And Tarif, thank you for the call. Real quick, my producer Raheem is asking me to give a quick shout out and request to Brave calling in from Atlanta. Raheem is asking Brave, you please contact him at his email, raheemtheproducer@gmail.com. And that is the spelled with an A. So Raheem, THA, Raheem the producer. That's RAHIM, THA producer @gmail.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan signing off today. Thanks, engineer Andre. Thank you, Cam and Raheem. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. And thank you for listening. Be back tomorrow, folks.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one is in the history books. I would imagine we're listed somewhere. Let's see. We have Wesley Walker. Don't take no nonsense, JT. Wesley, as always, try not to. Try not to. All right, I'm going to end this. You guys are going to see me a little bit later today. I want to thank all of you, as always, for joining us for Fault Lines. I am signing off, and I will talk to you probably in a couple of hours. Thanks all. See you tomorrow. Well, for Fault Lines, I'll see you tomorrow. But, under normal circumstances for us, I will see you guys a bit today. People in the cities think they're so advanced. Let's see. This is Why Are You So Angry? I love that name. AJC, peace all. Time to save your game and start working on the build. Yeah, for quick disconnects, might try distribution block someday. Snork, Y2K, Snork, what's going on? I disagree. They need to filter at the point of use. It would be years to clean out the contaminants from the pump or faucet. I was wondering that. That's why I asked, like for example, if I was pulling water, let's say from a well, and the water was dirty, and so I put it in a filter, and then we find that the filters dirty up fast, then the question becomes, okay, well, is there any way to clean the water? Because in any circumstance, the water that's coming in is going to be dirty. So how do I clean the water at the point of source? And is it even possible to do so? And what is the work associated with it? As opposed to continuously changing the filters and just living with the dirty water. Like, I got to be honest, I don't know enough about it. But my first thought was, like, how do you stop the water from being dirty if the water is pulled from a dirty source? No, Snort, it's an interesting question, man. So thank you for chiming in. Snort, I had to design ultra purification for my own electronic factories. Well, there you go. There you go. If this was software, I could answer it. If this was building some kind of conceptual system using databases and code and stuff like that, I could totally comment. But this is a real physical, tangible thing, and this is beyond my skill set. Says human 3ST. No, my purpose is existence. I just happen to be black, and how you look, your shape, your size affects how you survive in any environment. I need a slice, bro. I ain't playing, man. Damn. Yeah, you're right. If you were in a game space, whatever the game space is, and you were thrown in a society, how you sound, how you look, your physical features, your height, your weight, all of those things are going to be either attributes or hedges based on environment. They're going to be things that are going to be beneficial. They're going to be things that are going to be a detriment. And you, as a conscious entity, is stuck trying to navigate those things, especially in the context to what your society is telling you is the point, is objective, is positive, is negative, etc., etc. Yeah, says human. I agree with you, man. Totally. All right, I'm going to end this here. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all. I'll see you.